Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell.
A young man, a lawyer. In the dentist's chair, he's wiggling his face, waving his hands, making strange, muffled noises. Just a little more patience. The dentist calms him down. Just a little bit more. The doctor raises his head, looks for his assistant with his eyes, points to some device with his gaze and waits. Nancy gets angry. Doctor, stop flying in the clouds. Guess what? The young woman looks at the doctor confused, then quickly grabs the appliance and hands it to the dentist. The patient continues to fidget in the chair. His eyes are full of confusion and pain. He is mooing, poking his fingers into his mouth. The doctor frowns. To remove the saliva, he clarifies. The patient nods his head in relief. He stretches his hand up and gives the doctor a thumbs up. The dentist drills his gaze back to the assistant. Nancy, are you keeping an eye on the patient? His voice changes to a shout. Yes, sorry. Nancy picks up the appliance and sets it in motion. Aya, I'm sorry. The assistant continues to apologize. The dentist, disgruntled, shakes his head disappointedly. When the procedure is over and the patient's extension or mouth is taken out, he quickly rises from the chair. He moves behind his warm jaw, runs his hands over his face, spits it out into a special jar and looks reproachfully at Nancy. George. He turns to the doctor. Where'd you pick your assistant like that? The Center for the Retarded. I almost choked on my own saliva. He's trying to get to his feet, but he's not doing so well. A lot of people are quiet after being horizontal for so long. Change the assistant, or I won't be back for a second appointment. This is outrageous. I will complain. George the dentist calmly listens to the young man's complaints. He puts on a benevolent smile, conciliatingly says, I agree with you completely. I'm sorry. I'll change the assistant by the next appointment. The young man nods contentedly, breaking out in a cold sweat. What do you mean I'll change assistants? The woman thinks in confusion. I can't lose my job. Her hands shake. Her legs become absorbent cotton from heavy thinking. She's snapped out of it by a patient's voice. Look at her. She's probably drinking like a horse. He's visibly angry. He takes a step toward Nancy and points his finger angrily at her. I wish you all the worst. The dentist approached the young man and took him gently, almost friendly, under the elbow. Well, shall we go to payment? Aha, let's go. The boy nodded sternly and followed the doctor. George led the patient away from the office. Nancy began to clean up. Her mind was spinning not to fire, not to fire. She herself realized that she had been doing a bad job lately because of the problems that had accumulated like a snowball at home. The woman had almost stopped sleeping. She stopped at the sink, looked up and stared at her reflection in the mirror. Her once thick and colorful hair, having lost its former beauty, was sloppily gathered into a tiny bundle. The gray strands were mixed with some gray faded hair color. The hair used to be a different color. Had it been? Deep wrinkles, like ditches. If the wrinkles were filled with water, they would turn into rivers of circles under her eyes' dull, earthy, clear complexion. Nancy had no time to notice when she had aged so much. She didn't even notice when her life turned into a real survival of the fittest. Nancy, what's wrong with you? The doctor crept up from behind. The woman quickly turned around to face him. Even from behind his glasses, the fierce look of dark eyes could be seen. You know very well yourself. You're not the first patient to complain about you. What are you getting paid for here? George, forgive me, Nancy, I began to justify myself. You know my James is sick, Kevin, he's The woman clutched at her heart. The doctor helped her into the nearest chair. He gently began the conversation. I understand, Nancy. I understand perfectly well. But understand me and understand our patients. If I'm in your position all the time, maybe it's time you stepped into mine. I've already had 2 regulars this week who switched from signing up with Anatoly to me. You do realize that you and I are losing our legitimate raises because of this. Nancy guiltily, she lowered her head. It won't happen again. I promise I'll be careful. No one will ever complain about me. The doctor sighed and shook his head. Tell me how many hours you slept this night as well. Nancy hesitated for a moment. I don't. And how are you, my dear, going to work carefully if you can't even get a good night's sleep? Nancy, we're not making sausage in a factory. I'm a doctor. These are living people. It's important and necessary to be attentive, focused, and careful. The woman remained silent. Her gaze was fixed on the floor. George exhaled loudly. That's it. I'm not going to fire you. I know how much you need the money. Nancy raised her head. She looked gratefully at her boss. Thank you, I wasn't finished. He's been hanging around for a while. I'll give you a couple weeks off to drink. Take care of your family. Take care of your problems. We'll see what happens from there. George, I'm a doctor. I interrupted a woman. Nancy, that's it. You're free to go. What am I going to do without money? I need to work. I need to feed my family. The doctor's eyes rounded with surprise. He took off his glasses, rubbed his arm, and shifted. You're married, Nancy. Maybe you're earning money, I suppose. That's it, go now. I've got an appointment coming up. And I still have to find a free assistant. You're on paid vacation for 2 weeks. Don't come back before then. We'll see about that. He put his glasses back on and walked briskly. He left the office. Nancy cupped her face with her hands. That meant the conversation was over. The woman walked home. It was late spring. The fruit trees were covered in white branches. The grass was getting stronger and stronger. Nancy turned into the yard to shorten her driveway. Usually she took the bus home, but today even $3 couldn't be extra now. Money was getting scarce. Nancy's salary was the only steady income in the large family. George was right. The woman was indeed married, except for her husband. He couldn't be relied on at all. He didn't have a steady job. There wasn't a month that went by without a man holding down a job until the end and getting scandalously fired. He tried honestly, found some part-time work, but every time he failed. He drank like hell and couldn't go to the workplace anymore. He swore he wouldn't drink anymore, crawled on his knees. But every time, the same scenario happened over and over again. He drove, came to his senses, found a new job, and went back to drinking. Nancy had given up hope for him. She lived with him out of inertia, after all, 2 kids and 25 years of marriage. And there was nowhere to go. The family's only property was a small 1-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town. Nancy's life was difficult, depressing, and one might even say unbearable. Nancy kept walking. She walked along long gray 5-story buildings surrounded by a patch of swords, unevenly sheared from the bushes by a couple of weeds. Now and then bumping into local alcoholics and other marginalized people. The sun was already setting. Nancy passed by a playground where some noisy group of teenagers were sitting. She looked in their direction and was horrified. The young boys were drowning in cigarette smoke. Each of them had a bottle of beer or some other alcoholic beverage. The woman raised her eyes to the sky and said to herself, God, if only Kevin were home, if only Kevin were from the playground, came a drunken boy's voice. Kevin bet you can't drink a bottle of whiskey in one gulp. Her oldest son, Kevin, a 10th grader, had gotten involved with some bad company lately. She's punished her son, kept him home, deprived him of money, but all to no avail. The teenager, sure that parents do not understand anything, ran away and openly spit on the moral teachings of his mother. At first, when he was just beginning to enter the difficult age of transition, Nancy prayed that her son would not start smoking. A couple days later, she found a pack of cigarettes in his room. Then the woman feared to her heart's content to discover that her son had tried alcohol, especially with such a heredity. Thought the woman was a week away. A drunken Kevin was brought home by some suspicious men. Now Nancy's praying to God for something else. For God to get Kevin off drugs. But sadly, her prayers were not answered. Toward the end of the school year, she received a call from the school informing her that Kevin had been spotted doing something strange in the restroom. The woman barely managed to convince the principal not to call the police to the school. But her son was not promoted to 11th grade. The woman cried, urged Kevin to come to his senses, to stop smoking, quit pot, to study. But he just brusquely waved his mother away. It turned out that he stopped going to school at the end of winter. The The boy did not appear at home every day either. The woman cried and prayed, prayed and cried. She didn't know how else she could influence her son. Hearing the name of her oldest child, Nancy stopped. Staring, straining her eyes to the point of pain, she hoped it wasn't her eldest son there amongst the rowdy bunch of bullies, some other Kevin's alien, wayward child. With all her might, she began to listen to the conversation on the playground. "Make that too." Laughing, the teenager replied. The woman's heart clenched with pain. She recognized the voice. It was her son. With deliberate confidence, she walked toward the playground, shouting loudly to Kevin, "Kevin, go home." A stern tone reprimanded the woman as she approached the children. The teenagers laughed loudly. Some jumped up and ran away. And some continued to sit there, holding out their beers. Maybe the parents of those kids didn't care about them. Or maybe they couldn't handle the situation as well as Nancy herself. Kevin yelled at his laughing friends and moved toward his mother, his staggered cigarette in his hand. "Don't embarrass me. Get out of here," snapped the teenager. Son, let's go home." "What are you doing here?" "You still have to take exams next year to enter the institute." Nancy tried to take her son's hand. He brusquely waved it away. "Leave me alone." "I don't give a shit about your institute." He spat loudly on the ground. "Kevin, you wanted to be an economist." The woman started to lose her temper. "I'm a mom. Are you delusional? Get off." He turned around, shouted to his friends to leave. The company obediently got up and followed him. Tears came to Nancy's eyes. She stared at her son's back for a long time. Unable to change anything when he disappeared around the corner, the woman went home. She realized that after such a scandal, Kevin would not come home for a long time. Nancy entered the apartment. She took off her shoes and slipped her feet into tattered old slippers. Walked through the narrow hallway, stopped in the bathroom, washed her hands, and found herself in the kitchen. Right at the table, leaning on her arms, bent over, sat her precious husband. He was snoring loudly, and next to him stood an empty whiskey bottle. The woman looked around the room, shabby all-in-darkness walls once painted in a pleasant turquoise color, old, yellowed refrigerator from the old days. Dirty with black spots of chips and painters, the bathroom, the sink. She closed her eyes powerlessly. She wanted the old apartment to magically turn into a new one with a beautiful modern interior. Lately, the woman had been dreaming of renovation, but there was no way to do it. And how all this money, a lot of money. And as you know, this very money in the family did not have. So what should she do? She exhaled loudly and opened her eyes. The interior hadn't changed. In front of her still rose a mountain of unwashed dishes and the same dirty blue-gray walls. Her husband hadn't changed either. He was also lying with his head on the table, and that head of his had not at all grown back his curly hair. She poked her husband lightly on the shoulder and shouted, Frank, get up." The man raised his head, looked around the kitchen with a blank, uncomprehending stare. He mumbled something and dropped his head back on the table with a clatter. After a couple seconds, he clapped again. Nancy waved his hand irritably in his direction. I reached into the refrigerator, pulled out a pot of uncomplicated and simple food, put it on the stove to heat. I put the food on 2 deep plates for myself and my youngest son. Ran to change into home clothes, quickly put on an old, confused robe, returned to the kitchen, put the plates on a tray, and headed for the small room. Turn off the kitchen light beforehand. Let her husband sleep at the kitchen table tonight. She went into her son's room, where the youngest sat staring at an old computer screen. James, hi. She walked forward, placing a plate of dinner in front of her son. How are you? Hi. The boy looked away, then stared at the monitor again. What's up, Daddy got drunk again? James asked in as casual and calm a tone as if he were wondering what was for dinner today. Drunk. Nancy answered thoughtfully. Have you done all of today's assignments? Didn't forget anything, the woman inquired. Her youngest son could not go to school due to illness, so he was homeschooled. Haha, replied the boy and immediately wailed loudly. They killed me. He slapped his hand on the keyboard in frustration. You interrupted the offender, said James. The woman looked sadly and reproachfully at her son. He looked down guiltily and calmed down. She moved the plate to her son. "Eat, or it'll get cold. Now I have to go to the bathroom." The boy reached for his crutches, trying not to touch anything on the table. While still very young, James had suffered a severe injury. He broke his femoral neck while bicycling. It took the boy a long time to recover. His entire childhood was spent in the walls of all kinds of hospitals, but unfortunately, the femur fused incorrectly, depriving the child of the ability to move independently. James needed an expensive operation, and for the last few years, the family tried to save the necessary amount of money for it. But the money was saved with great difficulty. The father of the family at some point became drunk, and Nancy's salary was not enough even for the normal maintenance of the whole family. What was there to save? Nancy had a strong feeling that with each passing day, the chances of making James undergo an operation were getting farther and farther away. After all, it was impossible to save up, and there was no opportunity to have such an operation free of charge. Nancy held out her hand to her son. "Let me help you." Did the boy accept? No, I clumsily got up on crutches and left the room. Nancy took a moment to look around again. After all, this was the room James shared with Kevin. She ran her eyes over the table, ran her hand over her eldest son's bed, squatted down, and looked under the bed. A small package caught her eye. The woman took it out and unwrapped it. It was a tiny black woman's purse. I think they called it a stool. Nancy jabbed painfully. A horrible guess. The son of a thief. Not that she dumped the contents directly onto the floor. In the bag were a few crumpled bills and some sort of bag of white powder. The woman only let out a quiet gasp. It was undoubtedly drugs. She angrily stuffed the entire contents of the bag back in, opened the window, and what was the point of tossing the find into the distance? That's when her youngest son came back into the room. He, noticing the change in his mother's mood, cautiously inquired, "Mom, why me?" Nancy's eyes went black. She slowly settled down on the table. "James, have you noticed something strange in Vanya's behavior?" The woman asked the teenager. The boy visibly changed, frowned, turned his face away. I'm hungry, he said quickly. "Let's go to the kitchen." Nancy covered her face with her hand and spoke in a weak voice. "No, Daddy's asleep. Let's go here." The next morning began rather unusually. For the first time in a long time, Nancy was not in a hurry to go to work. She woke up to bright sunlight, as usual, around 6 o'clock, a perennial habit, and made her way to the bathroom. Washed herself cursorily, trying not to look at the cracked sink and the affected condensation-covered pipes. The sight of his own bathroom caused Nancy nothing but disgust. Since it itched, she put on an old robe, yawning. The woman went out into the kitchen. The husband was still asleep. It seemed he hadn't even changed his posture since last night. Nancy gingerly approached her spouse, touched the pulse on his neck. Alive! It went through her head, and the woman exhaled with relief. She took in a breath of air and said firmly to Frank, "Frank, get up," and shook her husband by the shoulder. The man jerked, raised his head, and finally his eyes became conscious. "Why are you yelling?" "Oh," Frank gently touched Sands for water. "Pour it yourself." Nancy pressed her lips together. "What is it this time? What's up with your job? I almost got fired. You're gonna have to support your family." "Fired how?" Frank was genuinely surprised. "And how are we going to live before we're fired?" Nancy grumbled unhappily. "I'm telling you almost. Are you even listening to me?" She rolled her eyes. "God, what a jerk. What's going on with your job?" "I repeat, with work." He was thinking. It was like he was remembering something that happened a long time ago, when in fact he had the job yesterday. "So I got fired, that's what. And you, of course, not your fault," ironically muttered the woman. At this moment she was pouring boiling water over instant coffee in the couch. "And bad from this cup is not my fault." Frank did not understand the sarcasm. "Well, drank a shot in the morning to avoid a headache. That's all. And who are they? The bosses? Who else? They've dealt with it, fired someone, even if they didn't understand the situation. Fucking Frank, what's there to deal with? You can't drink in the workplace. She got angry and put the mud on the table. Dark brown liquor spilled out, staining everything around her. I know you're shot. Bottle minimum. Fucking alcoholic. She wrinkled her nose. Frank looked out the window, still unable to get up from his seat. Fucking hell, the man repeated after his wife. That's right. He slapped his forehead loudly, then grimaced at the pain in his temples. Mother will be here soon. I completely forgot to tell you what. Nancy wondered. She looked at her husband questioningly, raising her mug. Your mother. What else would she be? She called about a week ago, saying she was coming to visit us soon. I almost completely forgot to warn you. He smiled indignantly. Well, pour some water. Fuck you, shouted the woman. We don't need your mother, we have enough problems without her. She rushed around the room, spilling you the remaining coffee. Tell me where are we gonna put her? We don't even have a bed for her. I'll think of something, Frank said hesitantly. You better think of a job. The woman snapped at him. The conversation between the couple was interrupted by their youngest son. What are you doing, Peter? I can't listen to this. The boy looked frightened, pleased. Nancy was pointing his finger at his husband. Scared the kid. No, tell me, are you happy? Mom, you started it. James stood in the kitchen doorway, leaning on his crutches and trembling hands shakily supporting him, swaying from side to side. Sorry, son, just your daddy. Nancy took a deep breath, trying to calm herself down. Come, eat your porridge and let's go for a walk. You need some fresh air. Do you? She shifted her gaze to her husband. Look for a job immediately. The woman walked, embarrassed, past her son, out of the kitchen. The boy followed her. I'll find one, enthusiastically said Frank, left in the room completely alone. Having finished their walk, Nancy and James returned home dragging the teenager, along with his crutches, into the entryway was completely inconvenient. And the woman once again spoke unkindly of her husband. Your father should have come down to help us, resented Nancy, puffing, lifting her son up the stairs. Mammy, but you asked him to? Suggested the son. And now? Can't he figure it out for himself? Nancy continued to grumble. Okay, we're almost home. They finally got up, entered the apartment, and stood like a stumbling block. Straight from the kitchen came the chiming and cheerful voice of Nancy and her mother-in-law. Not again, quietly whispered Nancy. Mama, Grandma, James asked. He looked questioningly at his mother. It looks that way, son. Of course, James had seen his father's mother before. It was just that it had been so long ago that he hardly remembered her at all, and the teenager has only ghostly, fragmentary memories of his grandmother. How, even before his injury, he had been running and jumping merrily across the green lawn and being a visitor to her in the village. Nancy, on the other hand, of course, remembered her mother-in-law very well. Once before the birth of their eldest son, the newlyweds had lived in this very village with Frank's parents. Then they bought an apartment in the mortgage, moved to the city, and communication with her mother-in-law almost came to naught. With her mother-in-law, Nancy called rarely, only on holidays. She never listened to what Frank's mother tried to advise, only answered on duty, clasping the phone receiver between her shoulder and ear. Yes, of course she did. Frank, on the other hand, had been in contact with his parents more often since his father's death. He began to visit his mother occasionally in the village, helping out with the household chores. The eldest son, Kevin, remembered his grandmother well, but he probably didn't care about her. Family ties, for some unknowable reason, were not particularly meaningful in Nancy and family. And helping her son do the same. Nancy tried to pull herself together. She inhaled deeply and exhaled several times, gritted through her teeth. Honey, go say hi to Grandma. And after the teen obediently pointed toward the kitchen, the woman stealthily skipped into the bathroom, quickly washed her hands. Half-water and tired face ran a comb through her hair. She opened her eyes wide a couple of times, trying to control the painful sensations, and firmly told herself to calm down, looked at her reflection once again, and giving herself a promise not to say anything rude to her mother-in-law, even accidentally, entered the kitchen with everyone else. Clara, am I glad to see you? Nancy smiled and lied to her mother-in-law directly into her eyes. The mother-in-law smiled widely. She was already sitting upright in her favorite chair in a masterly manner. Nancy thundered from the bread from the biggest cup she found in the house. The tea quickly assured, in bags long, rustling skirt seemed to take up all the surrounding space. "Nancy, darling." "Hi. Hi." The woman gestured with her arms spread wide, urging Nancy to come over and hug immediately. Reluctantly, Nancy approached and hugged the seated sailor, her immediately fiber a rather pleasant smell. Her mother-in-law smelled a complex range of scents that guessed leftover milk black currant and something else sort of herbal. Nancy smiled involuntarily for a moment, back to the distant countryside of her youth. "Do you realize that my grandson doesn't remember me at all? I had to reacquaint myself with my own grandson." Clara laughed good-naturedly. "Where is the eldest? Where's Kevin?" Nancy was embarrassed. She turned away and began to wash the dishes. Out, she finally got it out. "How long will you be staying with us, Mom?" In a deliberately careless way, Nancy asked. "That's I don't know yet. It's hard to say." "Well, Frank, get my bag. I've brought you some goodies." Grandma smiled and clapped her hands loudly. Nancy and her son shuddered at the same time. The woman seemed to be thinking to herself, "Lord, she's so loud." Frank had already obediently brought a huge wheeled bag into the kitchen, from which Clara began to take out some jars and whistles. That's how her mother-in-law listed everything that was extracted from the vast depths of her swamp. "Here are strawberries, and this is from black currants. Milk, fresh bread." She sighed noisily at the smell of bread, lifted it close to her nose, and laughed loudly. "All about her own, I beg to differ. Yep, and this one we have goat." As Clara continued to pull more and more groceries out of the bag, Nancy bore a stern look from her husband. He caught her judgmental gaze and shrugged guiltily, saying, "I had nothing to do with it." James flapped his eyes in surprise. "Grandmother, why did you bring all these groceries? Did they pass the required health inspection?" The grandmother laughed even louder than the usual grandson. "That's what it means to spoil a child, the city and computers. Look, don't you give me any other checks. I told you fresh." The loud voice of the mother-in-law clearly bounced off the walls. "That kind of ping-pong ball." She laughed. She said, "Well, grandson, don't talk like an old grandfather to your mom." But look how Frank jumped, but quickly regained a serious expression under the stern look of his wife. Nancy mumbled, "Excuse me, I have to go," and stormed out of the kitchen. Running to the bedroom, she slammed the door loudly behind her, went to the window, and stared at the tree branches sticking out in different directions. Her mind was spinning. Why? Why did you come here? Nancy beat her hands against the windowsill with force. It couldn't be said that Nancy hated her mother-in-law. Rather, the woman simply couldn't understand or accept her. It seemed to her that Clara was too boisterous, too frivolous, and in some ways uninspired by her mother-in-law's rustic lifestyle. And her household inclinations were also incomprehensible to her. What the hell is poplar milk? She thought irritably. What if there is some kind of E. coli in it? And who's going to drink it? It will stay in the refrigerator. We'll throw out all these jokes of my mother-in-law. Her inappropriate laughter, straightforwardness, bordering on tactlessness in Nancy's view, and overly noisy voice caused the landlady only irritation. She was tired of Clara. Even during a 5-minute conversation on the phone, she could not even think of living with her again under the same roof. Gradually, Nancy calmed down a little, walked across the room, and flopped down face down on the bed. She thought it unlikely that her dear mother-in-law would deign to add some money to the family budget and feed her at her own expense. She quietly weighed bent with indignation, ducking her face into the pillow. At that moment, there was a loud knock on the door. Without waiting for permission to enter, Clara burst into the bedroom with a brisk step, looked around, and said in a loud voice, "What's up with her, Nancy?" "Nothing," in confidence. And again she laughed disgustedly. Nancy sat down on the bed, lost her face with her hands. Of course, in confidence, nothing. She smiled languidly. She could not tell her mother-in-law of her displeasure. She was raised to respect her elders. "No offense to me, honey, but you look a little too tired and panic-stricken. Maybe you should take a vacation." Nancy was indignant to the core. She was silent for a few seconds, trying to swallow her resentment, and then she exhaled and said quietly to Clara, "Darling, but where will I go? Who will I leave the whole household to?" "Who? Me, of course." The mother-in-law patted her daughter-in-law cheerfully on the shoulder. "Nancy was surprised at you." "No, not at all. It's not worth it for my sake to stay longer than you planned, especially since I'm on vacation as of today." My mother-in-law smiled. "It's true. What a lucky coincidence for you. Vacation is very, very important. Why were you sitting at home then?" Nancy started to explain that the vacation was not planned. Suddenly, she heard the front door open. She cried out Kevin and ran to meet her son. Clara, surprised by this reaction, followed her. "Kevin, where have you been? Why haven't you been home?" Nancy began to reprimand her son. The boy didn't even look at his mother. Then his grandmother came out of the room. She shouted happily to her grandson, "Kevin, what a grown-up you have become. What a handsome man." And the grandmother, without even letting Vanya change his shoes, came to him with hugs. "Grandma, what are you doing here?" Unhappily kicked the teenager. He reluctantly embraced Clara and in the next minute already disappeared behind the doors of his room. The women looked at each other. Nancy ran after her son. She stepped confidently into the room, and before she could open her mouth, she saw Kevin rummaging under his bed. The woman flashed a glare. "What are you looking for by any chance? A black purse? Where did you get it?" Kevin wanted to answer, but Nancy interrupted him. "You stole it. Come on." Tears welled up in the woman's eyes. Her voice broke into a scream. "More drugs. Kevin, shame on you. Think about your father and me." Clara appeared in the doorway and gasped and clutched at her heart. When she heard the screams, Frank and James came in as well. There was a tense silence in the room. Kevin, without saying a word, explained the relatives and left the apartment in a flash. Nancy, wiping away her tears, looked helplessly at her family. The first to raise her voice was Nancy's mother-in-law. "Oh my God, you're sure I'm sorry." Nancy, I myself didn't understand exactly what she was apologizing for. She ran her hand through her hair, returned her voice to its usual calm. Then James, "Let's go outside. Honey, let's take another walk." She walked out of her children's room. Her youngest son stood up on his crutches and obediently dragged himself after her. The next week passed relatively quietly. The in-laws made their beds in the kitchen, laying out the old and already well-worn couch. Kevin still made occasional appearances at home. He didn't say anything or explain anything. He looked okay, but he mostly dropped by to spend the night or to get something to eat. Nancy was at home most of the time because of her forced vacation. She didn't really have anywhere to go, no reason to, the woman thought. All her vacation consisted in walking with her invalid son. After all, he needs to be outdoors as often as possible, to walk, to develop his hips. Life with Clara seemed unbearable for Nancy. She was fed up with her left-handed mother-in-law, nagging her daughter-in-law time and time again, receiving her as if she were a 20-year-old girl again. She taught Nancy how to do the dishes, taught her how to cook, taught her how to clean. One fine morning, she even stormed into the bathroom and pointed out to Nancy that she wasn't brushing her teeth properly. The woman was filled with anger. How ridiculous of the old woman to teach me, she thought to herself. Nancy said patiently out loud, "Thank you for the tip." What annoyed her most of all was not even the mother-in-law's moralizing, but the look with which she presented it. The opposite side of the dance, eternally loudly ready, all her reproaches served under the guise of touching care. Nancy was getting sick of such hypocrisy. However, on proper reflection, she herself was to some extent hypocritical. Instead of expressing her displeasure to her relative, she smiled good-naturedly at her face and nodded, agreeing with every word she said. Frank went on a bender again and disappeared for 3 days. When he returned, he devoted all his time to eating, sleeping, and watching television. But Nancy gave him credit. Her husband, when necessary, stood up for his wife, gently putting his mother in her place. Mother, really? Nancy will teach her how to be a snot, Frank said. The sons, for their part, were as displeased with their grandmother as their mother. Once in a while, Kevin would come home and find their grandmother in the kitchen, humming loudly, and the pies in the big frying pan were smoky and smelled unbearable. It was burning with oil. True, the pies came out delicious. James was extremely dissatisfied with the fact that his grandmother constantly tried to deprive him of computer games. "Grandson, why don't you read a book?" she'd tell him. James only waved it away irritably. He was more interested in playing a shooter game. Once he said to his grandmother, "You don't understand, but at least in the game I can run." After this phrase, Clara, as it was hushed, thought, and left his youngest grandson alone. Time went on its way. The fragile white apple blossoms fell, and summer came. Nancy dreamed of only one thing, that her mother-in-law would leave as soon as possible one warm summer evening. The woman sat at the table in her kitchen, absent-mindedly watching some TV show and watching the soup simmering on the stove. The mother-in-law came into the kitchen on an empty stomach. Who cooks like that? Sitting there like an urn on the spot. She laughed at her dainty joke. "Go ahead and get some rest. I'm talking to you." And then off to the side. Nancy to herself forth the news, and aloud said Clara, "I'm dreadfully tired. I've only just sat down at all. You're not taking care of yourself. Go, I say, rest. I'm on you. I'm cooking." Nancy exhaled heavily and was tired of her mother-in-law trying to smoke her out of the kitchen. She chose her words carefully and quietly said, "Why are you always trying to get me out of the kitchen?" Clara opened her mouth, pulled out astonished, but did not have time to answer because Frank entered the kitchen. "Good evening, ladies." The man was neatly shaved. He smelled surprisingly pleasant. He seemed to be completely sober. "Frank, is that you?" Nancy theatrically carried the palm card. "That the drink is over. How long until the next one?" Nancy chuckled quietly into her fist. Frank was embarrassed, hushed, looked at his mom, searching her eyes for support. Then, in a cheerful tone, he said, "I'm going on a business trip. I'm leaving Nancy for Washington." He fixed the edge of his t-shirt. "I wish I could feel a little encouragement from my own wife." Did Nancy, laughing, shake her head? "What's next, Frank? You'll be back in a week, and you'll drink all the money you've earned. If they pay you back, of course, and I'll have to pay your way. We've been there." Clara, watching the couple arguing, "Frank, I'm very happy for you. You're going to the Capitol. You really should say something nice." There you go, picking up on your mother's words. A man learned from his mother how to behave with his husband. Nancy went into a frenzy. It flashed through my mind. "So live with your mom." Out loud, the woman said, "As usual, good luck, Frank." She went to the stove, turned off the burners, and silently left the kitchen. First, the forced Nancy of the new vacation of the fallen. Nearly 2 weeks had passed since her mother-in-law's arrival. Nancy was already boiling like a hot single kettle. Clara had already driven her completely crazy with her presence. Kevin still came home occasionally. Only now he was harassing his mother. "Well, when Grandma's going to leave?" The teenager kept repeating. James was expectedly not happy either. Frank was the only one who was walking around in high spirits, preparing for his imminent departure to Washington. On another Monday, Nancy, after doing all the housework and taking a walk with her youngest son, got ready and headed to work by 1 o'clock. She ventured out for the first time in a long time to put on some makeup, let her hair down and lightly bobbed. And all to show the bosses, "I've had a 100% rest." Nancy hoped George would take pity on her and allow her to resume her duties. She'd given the dentist advance notice. The woman arrived at the clinic. She knocked. She entered the office. "George, hello. How are you here without me?" Vacation assistant did not smile in the whole mouth, demonstrating her excellent health. The stern-looking doctor sat behind a wide, perfectly white desk. He raised his head, tearing his gaze away from the papers. "Ah, Nancy, hello, hello, hello. Come in, sit down." The woman obediently sat down. The smile continued to shine on her thin lips. The muscles of her face were almost cramped with excitement. Without waiting for the doctor's rejoinder, she gently asked, "So, George, when can I start work?" The dentist frowned and looked at his assistant carefully. He slid his gaze over her face, and it made Nancy feel even more uncomfortable. Finally, he asked, "How was your rest?" "Fine." Nancy nodded cheerfully. "I feel great. Thanks for the vacation. And where were you?" Nancy hesitated and quietly replied, "Home." The doctor shook his head reproachfully. "Nancy, I didn't just send you on vacation for nothing. You were supposed to be resting, recovering. And you're what?" He adjusted his glasses, touching the frames. "You look even more tired." Honestly, the woman was embarrassed. The smile disappeared of its own accord. George continued, "No makeup will help. I can see your condition. Nancy, you're tired as hell. I realize my son is sick, but that's no reason to beat yourself up like this." He got up from his chair. He stepped closer to the assistant, leaned against the edge of the desk. "You realize that your chronic fatigue affects not only you, but also those around you. It affects our patients first and foremost." He stood up and walked around the office with his hands behind his back. "I'll tell you something else, not as your immediate superior, but as a friend. Your chronic fatigue is taking its toll on your family. Think about what I'm saying. In the meantime, I can't allow you to assume your duties. Get some rest. Better yet, go somewhere for at least a week." Nancy was getting very angry. I thought to myself, what the hell am I going anywhere for? "You're so clever," she said out loud. "Swallow your resentment and anger again." "All right, I did." She got up heavy, brushed off a non-existent dust from her clothes, glanced at the doctor. "When can I start working?" "When you realize you've rested, slept, cleaned up. You'll know when that happens." He looked at her closely again. "Doesn't make me fire you. Go on. Goodbye, George. Have a nice vacation." Disappointed, panic-stricken, and even humiliated, Nancy once again walked home along the familiar road. Money was running out in spite of her austerity. "I'll have to borrow again," Nancy thought. "And we haven't paid off our previous debts yet." She could hear the cheerful and happy voices every now and then. People around her were laughing and talking animatedly, enjoying the good weather. Some woman exclaimed, "Look, Andrew, what flowers do you see? They weren't here before." Nancy unconsciously threw a dissatisfied glance at the flowered, which the stranger admired. The flowered was indeed excellent, except that Nancy had absolutely nothing to do with it. All her thoughts were preoccupied with problems, difficulties with the work of her son's upcoming surgery, which it seemed they would never do. Not seeing anything around from the tears that had returned to her eyes, she herself did not notice how she came to her house. Her husband had left on his business trip as early as the morning before, leaving Nancy alone with her problems, just as he always did. Only now her mother-in-law was added to them. To make it easy for her, she never even bothered to explain why she brought it from her village. The woman stopped at the front door and hesitated. She didn't feel like going home at all. She knew that as soon as she crossed the threshold of her own house, her mother-in-law would immediately start harassing her. Slowly, she decided to enter the apartment quietly, unnoticed, so that she would not immediately realize that her daughter-in-law had already returned. Nancy quietly opened the front door, changed her shoes, and began to rejoice in her son's room. Her goal was almost accomplished as suddenly something in her mother-in-law's voice carried all the way from the kitchen. It caught her attention. She went back to the kitchen door lurking and listened. The mother-in-law was talking loudly to someone on the phone, giving her a loud chagrin every now and then. Nancy rolled her eyes but continued to eavesdrop. Oh yes, of course, Clara was laughing loudly into the receiver of her cell phone. There wasn't much time left. Nancy nestled even closer to the door, just a little more, and she would run out herself, losing her slippers. The old woman was talking even louder than usual. Nancy noted sarcastically to herself that she thought it would make the connection better if she yelled. Suddenly, Clara said something that made the landlady's mouth dry and almost stopped her heart. "We'll be rid of our Nancy soon enough." There was another rude, loud cackle. Nancy stood frozen in place like a stooped man. Her lips were quivering with resentment and anger. Her whole body was covered with cold. Then the woman shook. Who is this old woman talking to? Could it be to Frank? Fearful speculation. Kevin thrust into her heart like sharp knives. Frank, how could you? Nancy was on the verge of hysterics. She had already stopped listening to her mother-in-law's phone chatter. She hadn't noticed when she ended the conversation. Shocked by what she had heard, the unfortunate tried to pull herself together to take away the trembling in her knees. She squared her shoulders as best she could. She took a deep breath and with a confident jerk opened the door leading to the kitchen. Explain yourself at once. Took the bull by the horns. Nancy, I heard who you were talking to. Clara jumped in Nancy's seat in surprise. Why do you have to be so scary? Am I that annoying to you? Are you trying to give me a heart attack? Clara laughed nervously, but she didn't look the way a person should look after so many days on the scene. Still just as carefree relaxed. Nancy for a moment even marveled and perhaps envied the appearance of composure and equanimity in her mother-in-law. This woman, even without knowing her vivacious, cheerful character, could in no way be called an old woman. And even an elderly, ruddy, riding healthy face almost wrinkle-free. So fine mesh around the eyes figure is still okay. Strong on the mannequin, of course, does not pull. Nancy noted to herself with a chuckle. But you can't call her a pillow either. Even the gray hair is almost imperceptible in the dark, shiny hair. What does she wash it with? Nancy thought absent-mindedly, and immediately remembered her mother-in-law's countless instructions about milk masks and nettles. And the bandages in them, apparently there is some good in it after all. She shook herself out of her non-local reverie, which was surely nothing more than a side effect of the shock she had just suffered. Nancy was shaking his head violently. Explain yourself. She repeated her demand more like an order. Out of breath, she stood in the middle of the kitchen, breathing heavily and clenching her hands into fists. Honey, what exactly did you hear? I don't understand. You'll have to forgive me, old woman. Nancy rolled her eyes. Don't pretend. I just heard you say you were going to get rid of Nancy soon. Who were you talking to? The mother-in-law chuckled nastily and said Nancy's sister-in-law's name in a long voice. Oh, you've got to be kidding me. You should definitely take a vacation, get some rest. You're dreaming up such passions. Who do you think I've been discussing such horrors with here? You were on the phone and stopped this circus. Nancy gestured angrily at the phone. It was lying next to its owner on the kitchen table. Clara clutched her head demonstratively. Poor girl. She picked up her glasses, hanging around her neck, pierced through a string. Put them on, picked up her old cot and her cell phone. Look, the last call I got was yesterday when I called my neighbor's place. What's wrong? You imagined it? The woman took her mother-in-law's phone in her hands. She looked, and indeed, the last outgoing call was yesterday morning. She returned the phone and thought. She wouldn't have had time to delete the call so quickly in the log. I just walked in out of the blue. And Clara kept broadcasting. How tired are you? My girl, how tired you are, poor little craftsman. Hurry up and get some rest. I'll cook everything myself and feed James. Nancy thought about it, helped, opened the refrigerator, took out a bottle of water from drinking directly from the neck, and quietly said, I don't believe you. You're always trying to send me away. Clara, but this is my home, and I'm not going anywhere, no matter how much you want me to. Do you have any idea how we live? I'm the only thing that keeps this place going. Don't you see how your son provides for his family? We've been trying to save up for James' surgery for over 4 years, and it's all for nothing. And Kevin? Nancy waved her hand. Her lips trembled, her cheeks flamed. She was about to have a real tantrum. Her mother-in-law got up from the sofa and, making soothing gestures with her hands, came up to her daughter-in-law and took her by the hands, despite her resistance. I'm telling you, it seemed. She said the last word loudly in syllables. Calm down, please. I'm telling you now, I'm telling you herbs useful. That again at work problems. Her voice sounded sympathetic and almost normal, without the usual naive cheerfulness of the topic translates. He's a bitch, Nancy thought, pulled away from her and a little slower, replied, I've extended my vacation. So you see, the mother-in-law clapped Nancy on the back with her hand, and she jumped in surprise. Clara spoke quickly, in her usual tone of voice. "I've been telling you for years, you need a change of scenery. Your boss thinks so too. You can tell you're a smart man. Doctors aren't stupid." She sighed. "That's it, go, dear. Don't bother me. Go and rest." Nancy threw her mother-in-law a suspicious look and silently walked out of the kitchen. The phrase she had heard a few minutes ago did not leave her mind. "We'll be rid of our Nancy soon enough." Who the hell was she talking to? Why her? Does someone need to get rid of Nancy? Or is she really going crazy already? The woman went to her youngest son, did the usual things, moved around the room, asked mundane questions like how the boy was feeling, then cautiously began to question her son on a topic of interest. "James, tell me, how do you like your grandmother?" The boy set a disgruntled face. "And here, and you do not know. I'm fed up with it." He looked around, lowered his voice. "Why did she even come here? How much longer is she going to be here?" "She didn't say," Nancy answered. And then she wondered. Really, how much longer would she have to put up with her? James continued to resent her. "He's lucky Path's gone. I wish we could go somewhere else." "What if she's here for good?" the boy asked fearfully. Nancy frowned. "I don't think so, darling. We'll try to find out tomorrow." The morning did not go well. All night Nancy tossed and turned, trying to get into a comfortable position and finally fall asleep. Sometimes the woman succeeded, but she slept. She was restless, constantly waking up for 30 or 40 minutes at a time. From the head never went away. Obedient conversation of the mother-in-law. Or maybe it really did show. Every time Nancy managed to sleep, after a while she woke up from nightmares. She dreamed of being kicked out of her home, of wandering the streets of the city like some kind of defense. Her mother-in-law laughing nastily at her. Get rid of Nancy. The woman kept repeating that phrase to herself. She couldn't understand what she had done to her husband's mother. She got up tired, lethargic, as her mind took in looking at herself in the mirror. It seemed to her that the dark circles under her eyes had gotten even darker. Even more so, she couldn't look at her reflection for more than 10 seconds. Finishing her morning routine, she walked to the kitchen. Her mother-in-law, already awake, was running briskly from the stove to the refrigerator, cooking something and humming at the top of her lungs. "Good morning, Clara." Nancy, you're a man, smiled, pressed the kettle button. "Good morning, Nancy O." The mother-in-law had a look of shock on her face. What was she pointing at Nancy's face? What? Where? Nancy twisted in one place, ran her hand over her face, ran into the bathroom to the mirror. She yelled right from there. "Clara, what is it?" "I don't see anything." Her mother-in-law unceremoniously followed her into the bathroom. "How can't you see the writing? You look like you've been tortured all night." She frowned and folded her arms across her chest, waddling past the bathroom. James threw a sullen glance in his mother's direction. "Thank you for noticing," Nancy said modestly and returned to the kitchen. She was tired of the constant insults from her mother-in-law, but she still didn't have the nurture to respond in the same manner. She poured instant coffee into a cup. The mother-in-law was alarmed. "Who does that?" "Take a spoonful straight from the jar." Nancy closed her eyes. She counted to 3 and took a deep breath. "Honey, how long are you staying with us? May I ask you for what purpose you have come?" The mother-in-law laughed. She walked over and snatched the boiling kettle out of her daughter-in-law's hands. "I better pour it. You're certainly now spread out." She carefully poured boiling water into the cup, and then finally answered, "I didn't just come here. I was called to your city church. They have a bishop's wife, seriously ill. I came to help. And you're all so tactful, so cautious. Why? Can't you see that I'm out every day until evening? What do you want to ask me where to?" She was silent. She stirred a little and spooned her tea and sighed. "For how long? It's hard to say, but I'll be with you for at least 6 months." There was a rumble and a loud creak. Hearing my mother-in-law's words, Nancy dropped the cup with hot coffee from his hands right on his lap. The mother-in-law immediately raised a shout. "How come, Nancy? How come?" She was rushing around the kitchen, looking for something to wipe up the spillage of the sticky drink. Nancy herself only repetitively repeated the words of her mother-in-law of 6 months, and never cleaned up the broken crumb. She walked out of the kitchen. Quickly collecting James, Nancy walked out of the house with him. The boy's hip had been hurting more and more lately, so he went outside in a stroller. The woman rolled forward and thought deeply to herself, 6 months is a long time. The woman remembered overhearing the conversation and got angry. "Mom, what are you doing?" James inquired, looking up at the frowning mother from below. Nancy was silent for a long time, and then confidently answered her son. "You and I are going to leave this house. I can't stand living like this anymore." The woman swallowed the lump that came to her throat and quickly wiped a tear with her sleeve. The boy, frightened, asked where. "Where will we go, to your aunt? Do you miss Aunt Christina?" "Yes," replied James cheerfully. "We will go to her villa. We will." Nancy pulled out her cell phone, dialed her eldest son's number. Kevin didn't pick up, so she dialed again. Ringing, ringing. And then the call was dropped. She swore softly and asked the younger son, "Do you know where your brother is?" From where James answered, "Then let's go look for him," firmly said Nancy and turned the stroller the other way. Together with her youngest son, she spent several hours outside. The summer sun was shining brightly, and the wind seemed to have left their town for good. James had already started whimpering, repeating he still wouldn't want to leave with us. Let's go without him. But Nancy never gave up trying to find her eldest son. She looked in all the secluded courtyards of the city, in parallel called him on the phone. As the sun was nearing sunset, Nancy exhaled tiredly. They still hadn't found her. She texted her son saying they were leaving and asked him to arrive as early as possible at his aunt's villa. Kevin knew exactly how to get there. After that, they returned home without saying anything to their mother-in-law. She behaved as usual, grumbling something, laughing loudly, making flat jokes. Early the next morning, having packed the necessary things, Nancy and James left their home apartment. Nancy was not a sociable person, very modest. She had never had any close friends in her whole life. Almost one, though, and that was Nancy's own sister. And not just a sister, but a twin, as well as the other twins' girls from small years were inseparable everywhere, and always they were together. All through childhood, all through adolescence, and even the very beginning of adulthood, the sisters had been almost as one. Nancy often thought about how lucky she was to have a sister, how lucky she was to come into this world not alone, but with a true friend. She knew that Sister Christina was her soulmate. However, as time went on, the sisters were no longer as close to each other as they had been in their childhood and adolescence. Adulthood put everything in its prosaic place. Nancy fell in love with her future husband at the age of 16. At 18, she was already married. Christina, on the other hand, took a different path. After high school, she entered the Faculty of Economics, and after the university immediately began to give all her time and energy to her own business. As a result, the sisters ended up on opposite sides of life. Nancy devoted herself to her family and Christina to business. It is worth noting quite successful and profitable business. Nancy arrived unannounced. She called her sister only when she and James were already standing at the gate of her large country house. There was a small and winding river running nearby, and the grounds themselves were surrounded by a thick and tall pine forest. The scent from the pine trees was magnificent. It seemed that the very air was here, especially after the bad city smog. Nancy pressed the video bell on the intercom, and in a couple of minutes the gate automatically opened, and Christina ran out to her sister. "How did I miss you?" Christina crouched down to James' stroller and hugged the boy tightly. Sis, she was coming to visit Nancy at her place. A long time ago, back when she was a baby. The sisters were constantly confused, even by their own family. Parents couldn't always tell where Christina was and where Nancy was. But things were different now. Nancy herself knew that she looked aged and tired, and even sickly. But she had never realized until today that she had been so frozen in place while her sister was happily counting something. She watched Christina. She was a young, undeniably beautiful woman, thick, short, light russet hair glistening in the sunlight. The bright sparkle of beautiful eyes, smooth, clear skin, straight posture, and perfectly tailored clothes. Confounded Nancy. She herself suddenly doubted that this beauty was her twin sister. Christina was dressed in loose beige slacks, a pulled-back white tank top, emphasized a good figure, and thrown on top of a short and large knitted beige poncho. Added to the woman some special charm of Christina smelled good perfume with a floral bright fragrance. Nancy managed to recognize the smell of lilies along with the scent of sunny fresh peach. She discerned beautiful gold earrings in the shape of little swallows on her sister. Nancy shivered in embarrassment. Coughing into her fist, she said, "You look great, sis, just gorgeous." Christina smiled softly, stood behind the stroller, and rolled James onto the lawn. Nodding to her sister in the direction of the house, she walked forward. "Thank you, Nancy. What happened in there? You look so tired." The woman sighed heavily. I'm exhausted. The house is a mess. Frank's a heavy drinker. It's nothing new, but my mother-in-law has moved in." Christina wondered how she moved in. "Why'd you call her?" "That's the thing. No one called her. She arrived, unannounced, you might say." James jumped into the conversation. Grandmother had come to the church to help some woman. "We have to," Nancy nodded. "Our local priest's wife was sick, and she'd come to help her." Nancy chuckled. "Why didn't the priest put her up in his house?" "I wonder." Christina, an unbearable woman, stopped the stroller with her nephew and suddenly summarized. "But she seems to be kind." Nancy, noting to herself that Christina understood nothing and knew nothing, looked around the house. It was a large wooden building with a flat roof, made in the style of high-tech. Wide panoramic windows glistened with cleanliness, neat. Lush pine trees grew along the edges of the house. Of course, the woman had been to her sister's villa before. Now, however, she was visited by a slightly gloomy flying head. Like that genetic feeling, Nancy suddenly realized that she was terribly jealous of her own sister. The sisters were sitting in the large, beautiful living room. They were seated on opposite sides of a long white sofa. In front of it was a large fireplace with a long glass coffee table between the fireplace and the sofa. On it stood 2 pretty mugs and words of new tea. Christina reached for hers and took a sip, surprised to find herself holding it out. "Yeah, well, that's what she said. I don't believe it." She looked at her sister skeptically. "No, I've definitely heard that phrase." "That's what she said, that she wanted to get rid of Nancy." "What's that supposed to mean?" "Well, there's no way that could have happened. No way. Look, maybe she was talking about some other Nancy. And you should have found out right away, told her to her face." Nancy smiled sadly. "Don't be ridiculous. It was definitely about me. And there was no point in finding out about her. I tried, I tell you, but it got me nowhere." She picked up her cup of tea, twirled it in her hands. "What's all this for?" "Alki husband, mother-in-law, mom. And the children?" Well, prevailing stretched the sister. "But what kind of sons do you have?" "I have none, as you know." Christina sighed softly and looked sadly at the flames. "And we'll get James back on his feet very soon. I decided that I would give you money for the operation," she added suddenly. "I'm exhausted. No more watching the child suffer." Nancy quickly slammed his eyes shut, trying to chase the tears from the corners of his eyes. She opened her mouth to reply, but couldn't get a word out. Instead, she burst into violent tears, covering her face with her hands. The nurse moved closer, put her arms around Nancy, and quietly asked what was wrong. Little Nancy answered through her tears. "Everything all at once. There is not a penny of money at all. Frank is drinking away everything he earns, if you can even call it money, and I've been suspended from work. I've been home for 3 weeks on my own dime. I'm in debt like a silk. Christina and Kevin's mine." "Ah, what? I thought he was fine." Nancy burst into tears again. "My Kevin, he's a drug addict." Christina looked at her sister in shock. She couldn't believe her ears. The eldest of her nephews, the woman had always considered a strong, healthy, young guy, an athlete, handsome. And here was such news. Christina was simply speechless. Continuing to clutch her poor sister to her chest, Nancy spent the rest of the day in tears. She tried to pull herself together and didn't want her youngest son to see her in such a state. but it was all in vain. The tears themselves poured from her eyes in hail. Nancy saw how well her sister lived and did not understand what she was doing wrong. She looked sadly at the expensive interior, at her sister's chic appearance, and was torn to pieces. On the one hand, Nancy was happy for her, but on the other, she was pained to realize that her sister's life had turned out much better than her own. The next few days passed relatively quietly. Nancy took many walks with her son, breathing fresh air. She even went mushroom picking a couple times. She realized that she felt much better here than she did at home. With every breath she took, she became calmer, and the peace of mind that came with the change of scenery somehow faded into the background. After a few days, Nancy was ready to go back, but her sister insisted that both she and her youngest son stay with her in the country, and they did. Nancy continued to call her oldest son from time to time, but he was reluctant to answer his mother. Only once wrote, "Mama, I'm fine, don't call again." One day, the woman cellars about another failed conversation with her son and decided to leave Kevin alone. What can I do? Bitter, Nancy asked herself. Her heart was heavy, but she really didn't know what to do. It was an early, hot, sunny morning. James was feeling much better and expressed a desire to walk on crutches to the river. Nancy, along with her son, set out for the walk. They walked quietly along a narrow woodland path leading straight to a small local beach. They walked past tall pine trees, past other people's houses. Every now and then they bumped into large stones and protruding from the sandy pathway studded and amber pine bark, yellow-green color of the pine forest. It was pleasing to the eye, soothing and filling with some unknown feeling. It was so serene here, birds hovered around. James would occasionally stop to point out to his mother a large fly agaric or blueberry bush. "Mom, look," the boy enriched himself on one of his crutches. With the other he poked in the direction of the berries. The woman stepped closer and plucked a handful of fresh blueberries. She handed the berries to her son and watched with pleasure as James flew them. The boy said dreamily, "I wish I could run down and pick them myself, and you could bring me berries and I'd turn my mother away." Tears came to her eyes again. She exhaled, answering son so and so. "Son, you'll see." They moved on. Nancy felt sad. She realized that she could not just take from her sister such a huge sum of money needed for the operation. What was she going to pay back with? Nancy walked slowly and kept wondering why the Lord had sent her such a punishment. When and with what she had managed to anger him so much. The fresh, damp smell of water hit her nose, smelling of wet wood and seaweed. With each step, it became easier to breathe, and little by little she began to feel dizzy. Nancy stopped and squinted. In the distance, the very beach could already be seen. The watery, greenish jubilant in the sunlight smoothness mingled near the horizon with the bright blue sky. The woman sighed and said happily, "Here we are at last." James wanted to clap his hands with joy, but he couldn't let go of his crutches. They walked out onto the empty, sun-drenched beach. The warm morning rays gently touched their skin. Somewhere in the distance, a small house rose up, and signs said that they could rent a boat there. Seagulls were flying around, and if you looked closely at the water, you could see a strong river current. James looked around happily and said, "Look, we're all alone out here." Cool, he pointed toward the water, coming closer and closer. "Mommy, come here." Nancy jumped up, ran after the boy. "Careful," he laughed back. "It's all right." He stopped by the water and turned his nose, turned his head and looked closely at his mommy. "Maybe we're swimming. It's so hot outside." "No way." The woman shook her head negatively. "Look at the current. You won't be able to stay on the water. I will." The boy shouted angrily. "Relax, you'll be all right by now. If anything, you'll catch me." The woman approached and grabbed her son's hand. He swung awkwardly to the side. She said sternly, "Don't even think about it." "What if I don't succeed?" "You've washed that one out, haven't you?" Everyone went back to the house. James frowned. He shouted angrily, "You always ruin everything." Nancy was taken aback. She slammed her eyes shut and quietly with bitterness in her voice. "I asked, spoiling things." The son didn't answer sullenly, staring into the sand. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to something behind Nancy's back. Following her son's gaze, she turned sharply in their direction. There was a man moving along the path. Judging by the figure, it was a man. Nancy shifted her gaze back to her son. Ask the man what an idiot you are. Why are you looking at him like that? Mom, let's ask him to help back me up during the swim, James asked with hope in his voice. The woman answered before she could even hear her son's arguments. No. What are you saying? What if he's some kind of maniac? Or just a man who has no time for us? We will not talk to strangers. There's no chance of that. She nodded toward the woods. Let's go home, son. We have a long walk. The boy mouthed forward disappointedly. Always you are so afraid of everything and run around. And we walk grudgingly, he said. Half an hour later, they returned home. Sis, good morning. How was your walk? Sister sat down next to Nancy. Oh, don't even ask, Nancy exclaimed. James is growing up and is beginning to show me his character. That's how Christina frowned. Scoot closer. Nancy told her sister about their morning walk and dialogue on the beach. Christina, well, how can I explain to him that I myself would like to swim and would like him to take a dip? But what? What can I do? With sadness in her voice, the woman said. She bent her arm at the elbow and cocked her head. It's not even my fault, really. Christina listened attentively to her sister as well. She got up, took a pear from her plate, twirled it in her hand, and asked Nancy thoughtfully, Why do you keep saying you can't do anything? Nancy hesitated for a moment. She got a little embarrassed, rolled her eyes at her sister. What do you mean by that? The woman sighed and smiled conciliatingly. I mean that you're always saying time after time that you can't do anything about it, even though you don't even try. Nancy looked at Christina in surprise, forgetting about her coffee. She continued to express her pain. Tell me, why were you afraid to meet that man? What if he really would have helped James to swim? After all, you could have taken your son for a ride. I'm afraid my nephew was absolutely right. You've always been like that, afraid of everything and running around. Christina sat down very close to Nancy and took her hand. You need to be more flexible over looking at things from different angles. You know what I mean. Relax. Nancy thought for a moment. She knew her sister was right, and she realized that no one but Christina would tell her the truth. The woman often refused to do something just because she was afraid. Her mother-in-law came to mind again. Why didn't I confront her right away? I ran away from my problems again. Sad, Nancy thought. Maybe I do need to be a little more free and decisive. Christina watched the expression on her sister's face carefully. She rose to her feet and said quietly to me, it's time to fuck off. I have to go to work and check on things. I'll be back in a couple days. Think about what I said. A couple minutes later, Nancy heard the sound of a car. It went on, and Nancy was still visiting her sister. She didn't worry about work anymore, but eventually she would find another one. Who would want her there? Her husband, an alcoholic in town, or an older son who won't even talk to her? And most of all, probably her mother-in-law, who wanted to live. She succumbed. She thought about Christina's words for a long time, analyzing and thinking about it. The woman thought that she was indeed too modest, indecisive, soft-spoken, fearful, and anxious. It occurred to her that it would be a good idea to try to correct this. At one point, she even recognized that George was right. She really was in desperate need of rest. One evening, she even ventured to call her boss and thank him. The man was glad to hear his assistant. He praised the woman and told her to rest as long as necessary, noted Nancy's fresher and more alert voice, and hinted that she would make up for it later. The woman herself noticed a favorable change in herself. The black eyes had disappeared, the fine lines had resolved, and the deep wrinkles no longer looked like glow worms. Her posture straightened, her hair regained its luster, and the main thing in my soul, there was hope. Seemed to be based on nothing in particular, but it was beautiful nonetheless. Christina, back at the villa, talked Nancy into a trip to the beauty parlor. There the woman got a good haircut and dyed her hair a bright chocolate color. While at the salon, Nancy even allowed herself to exchange a few phrases with a girl she didn't know. The woman felt the taste of life again. She suddenly realized that she was ready to fight her problems with renewed vigor. Once again, she and James went for a walk to the beach. When they reached the water, James said with sadness in his voice that it was a pity I couldn't go swimming. Nancy wanted to agree that it was a shame, but she restrained herself. She looked into her son's eyes and said confidently, "We'll think of something." Suddenly a voice came from behind. "Hello, you must be our new neighbors. Let's get acquainted." A stout man approached them. He walked briskly and waved at them. His thick gray hair was neatly enrolled, and on his round face it was as if it was written that he was a good man. On a normal day, Nancy would certainly have immediately turned around and walked away. But today the woman decided to change her habits. She took a step towards him and extended her hand to the man. "Hello, my name is Nancy, and this is my youngest son, James. Pleased to meet you." The man gently took her hand and kissed it unexpectedly gallantly. All the blood came to Nancy's face from embarrassment, and as if he hadn't noticed it, he turned to the boy. "It's nice to meet you, young man. My name is Leo. I saw you here a couple days ago, but you ran away so fast. Catch up with what? There was no way to catch up with you." He laughed merrily. "You recently bought a villa from us here. Haven't seen you before." No, we're here visiting, staying with my sister. We're resting, regaining our strength. James needs fresh air. It's good for him to walk, to build up his muscles." "That's right. You are good," the older man said and patted the boy on the shoulder. James was a little embarrassed, but he dared to say something. "And you? Would you mind backing me up? I'd like to swim so much. I can do it. My arms are strong. But my mom, she's afraid for me. Why don't you just stick around?" Leo laughed good-naturedly, but before he could answer, he was interrupted by Nancy. No, not at all. We have no right to stress you out." The woman looked embarrassed and began to move strands of her lustrous hair. "I'm only in favor of it," Leo agreed cheerfully. "I was going to suggest it myself. I can assure you that amateur swimming is mostly hands-on, and it's not very deep. The current may seem strong, but it is deceptive. I'd be happy to help you." Nancy fell into a stupor. Her first thought was to say goodbye to that man, turn around and walk away, but moved by her fear for her son, she agreed. "Thank you, Leo. Let's give it a try." The woman helped her son off his extra clothes, took his crutches from him. Leo proved to be a sturdy man, though he was much older than Nancy. He put his shoulder to James for support, and they went into the water together. The boy was absolutely delighted. He laughed and twitched amusingly as the water reached first to his waist and then higher. Nancy was overjoyed for her son that such a small, modest dream had finally come true. After meeting Leo, Nancy began to keep in constant communication with him. They saw each other often, went for walks with James, and talked a lot. The woman enjoyed talking to such an intelligent man. He reminded her of George in some subtle way. In the course of another conversation, it turned out that Leo was also a doctor. He often asked the woman about her son's illness. He asked about the causes of the disease, about its complications. Nancy answered every question without hesitation. But when she finally learned that Leo was not just a doctor, but a professor and a leading orthopedic surgeon, she was shocked by such an unexpected gift of fate. The man gave them many recommendations, after the implementation of which James began to feel much better. One evening, Leo invited Nancy for a walk alone without James. He said he wanted to have a serious talk with her. Nancy happily agreed. And to her sister's reasonable question, what exactly would this conversation be about? She shrugged her shoulders absent-mindedly. How would I know? James did not object to this turn of events. He was happy to stay at home with Aunt Christina. Nancy, good evening. Leo smiled broadly at his companion. You look more and more beautiful every day. I must say Nancy smiled modestly and thanked him. Thank you. How are you doing? Leo, I'm fine. Went to my clinic today to check on the staff without me. Not a prankster. Can't be on vacation for too long, you know. We're workaholics. He laughed softly. There's something I wanted to talk to you about. Yes. Nancy looked at her companion carefully. During the conversation, they walked slowly along the neighboring plots, stopping now and then to take a closer look at a tree, a shrub, or a flower. I've been thinking about your case for a long time, and James is such a nasty injury and not well treated. Poor kid. In general, I consulted with colleagues, and we would like to offer you a high-tech operation using titanium fonts. In our city, this method is used only in our clinic. He stopped abruptly, looked Nancy in the eyes. Nancy lowered her gaze. Thank you, Leo. Thank you for your generous offer, but we can't afford it. We don't have any money at all. Nancy, she shook her hands dramatically. You've got me all wrong. I'm offering you the surgery for free. The woman was speechless. What do you mean? Free? She said shyly at last. It doesn't work like that. Leo answered her questions patronizingly and with favor in his voice. He spoke in the tone of voice that teachers usually use when patiently explaining a new topic to their students. Of course, there's no such thing as free. I meant free for you. I'll take care of all the expenses. Nancy was about to begin to retort. Her eyes flickered, and her hands shook slightly. But the man stopped her with one lordly gesture of his hand. Nancy, you don't have to worry about me. I'm not poorer for it. I can afford it. I'm interested in your case from the point of view of my research. So you can consider that by putting your son at my disposal, you will pay the clinic for the operation. He said firmly, you will have to come to my clinic next week. We'll do all the necessary tests there. We'll take the tests and set a date for the operation. Well, why don't you say something? Nancy couldn't believe her happiness. She had dreamed of this operation for so long. She knew just as well as James dreamed of being able to walk again. He often told his mother about his dreams. In them, the boy was running, going to school, playing sports. She stood there unable to get a word out of herself. Tears glistened in the corners of her eyes. But they were different tears, tears of real happiness. Finally, the woman spoke. Thank you. Thank you. I can't believe it. Leo, I'll pay you back the full amount. I promise. Leo put his hand up again, interrupting Nancy. If I wanted you to pay me back, I would have lent you the money. Please stop bickering. Think of your son, the man said, almost angrily, and pointed forward, inviting Nancy to continue their walk. Excuse me, oh, I'm sorry. The woman followed her interlocutor, trying to find the right words. So when can you come to the clinic? The doctor repeated his question. Nancy, I smiled gratefully. We are completely free. As you wish, the woman replied. Well, let's go then. He stopped talking, pulled out some kind of notebook, resigned to making notes. Let's do it this Wednesday. Okay. Later, I just don't know how to thank you. Leo smiled and held out his hand to her. The best thank you for me would be if you are in a good mood, and give it to your boy. On the way back, Nancy did not walk. She literally flew home, unable to feel her feet under her from happiness. And from time to time, she still stopped to pinch her arm. It seemed to her that everything that was happening around her was a beautiful dream. When she returned, she immediately told her sister about everything. What a stroke of luck. How lucky are we? Christina rejoiced. Nancy, I got some myself, but the same phrase kept running through her mind. Everything is for a reason. After some thought, Nancy decided not to tell her son about the operation. She didn't want to give him false hope. The tests would be bad or something. However, James himself realized that something good had happened. His mother was too happy and elated when she learned about Leo Pavlovich's proposal, which was presented to him as a complete examination. The excited boy sat up on the bed and clapped his hands. Mommy, I feel that Leo will definitely help me. I will walk on my own again without crutches, without a stroller. You will, Nancy answered him. She gently stroked her son's head and began to help him get ready for bed. It was deep into the night when Nancy sat alone in the silence of the Grand Palace. The sky was clear and starry. A light warm breeze faintly touched her face. The silence of the dacha village died away, made somewhere in the distance. Thinly and pitifully cried the unknown night birds. Nancy sat on the bench swing, admiring the clear sky, noting a familiar constellation. The smile never faded from her face. Suddenly, she thought she recognized a constellation of fish in the sky. The image of her husband immediately appeared in her mind. According to his zodiac sign, he was a fish. However, she was disappointed in him. Lately, she suddenly realized that she missed him, and still loved him. Frank had gone away to work shifts before. True, such work never brought anything to the family. He always came home drunk. As a rule, he started spending the money he earned on the way to his hometown. Although it was not always possible, but the couple usually called each other. During Frank's departure, they exchanged the latest news and just talked on the same watch. Did anything change? Frank never called Nancy. Neither did she. The resentment against her drinking husband was too strong. She sighed heavily. She wanted to call her husband and tell him all about the new acquaintance, the surgery, and all the changes that had happened to her over the summer. She twirled a cell phone in her hands and tucked it into her pocket. It's getting late, Nancy thought, flinging it skyward. One more mesmerized look and went to bed. Before Friday, they had already done all the necessary tests. Now all that was left to do was wait. Would James be allowed to undergo surgery? Leo's clinic happened to be in a neighboring large city. It was modern and clean, and the doctors seemed very qualified. James, like his mother, was absolutely delighted. He enjoyed looking at everything here. He walked the corridors, happily met the staff, and even made friends with one of the patients. It was a boy the same age as James. Also preparing for the upcoming orthopedic surgery, Nancy was glowing with happiness and prayed to God that the tests came back good and my son had the surgery. I still can't believe how lucky we are. Christina, who had come to visit them, said to her. Me too. Wow, I didn't want to talk to Leo at first. I was afraid of him, and I was afraid to talk to just anyone. Nancy answered thoughtfully. I told you a long time ago. Remember, it's time to make some changes in your life. You see how everything has turned out so well now. Even your mother-in-law, she's here for a reason. Oh, I don't agree with that. Nancy laughed. She's been bleeding me dry. By the way, Christina put her cup on the coffee table. You've already told Frank when he's coming back. Frank said Nancy's husband's name thoughtfully. Frank, no, I haven't. We haven't spoken since he left. Nancy, the sister said indignantly. How can you do that? He is, after all, James's father. He has a duty to know. You're right, of course you're right. Nancy fixed her clothes and stared blankly out of the window. So why don't you just sit there? Call him and tell him. Call him myself. The woman was genuinely surprised. Of course, we didn't quarrel, but after that obedient conversation, I don't know what to think. You won't know until you get up the courage to call. Christina parried. Calls come on. Nancy reluctantly pulled out her phone and decided to call her husband after all. Whatever kind of relationship were they in, Christina was right. He had to be aware of the upcoming surgery. James. She selected the right contact, pressed the call button. It buzzed. He didn't answer the call. The woman put the phone away, looked at her sister. She understood without words. No answer, Nancy said. And resentment began to choke her again. I think this is the end. What end? Christina raised her eyebrows indignantly. Come on, don't get so worked up. As you can see, Clara, by all appearances, succeeded in her plan. She divorced us. Nancy sighed sadly. She didn't know whether she should be sad or happy. But then the phone rang. Frank calling back. With hope in his voice, Christina asked. Nancy glanced at the cell phone screen. Her eyes lit up. It was Leo. Hello. She quickly answered the call. After a few seconds, a smile of joy lit up her face. Yes, thank you. Nancy counted into the receiver. When she put the phone aside, Christina looked at her sister expectantly. So did the surgery get scheduled? Yes, Nancy smiled broadly. Yes, it's scheduled for the very beginning of September. Nancy. Christina jumped up to her sister and hugged her tightly. How excited am I? She released the woman from the hug and looked at her carefully. You can deal with Frank later. What matters now is our James. Nancy was happier than ever. Finally, at least one of her problems was almost solved. She walked briskly to the yard to find her son and tell him the good news. It was nearing the middle of August, and the first leaves were beginning to fall from the trees. Nancy and her son continued to visit her sister. Nancy, you might say, had finally come to her senses. She herself noticed how she looked better and felt better and better every day. She had almost learned not to be afraid of everything in the world, no longer in perpetual stress. She finally realized that everything in this life should be fought for, not just floating along. James, this vacation was good for him too. He gave up video games on his own, read a lot, and took up sports as much as possible for himself, and recommended by doctors. James was working out hard and preparing for surgery. He dreamed of one day riding a sport bike again. One day, Christina took Nancy shopping and her sisters shopping. Her friends picked out a new closet for her. Christina insisted on it and took all the expenses on herself, saying that was a gift. And so our heroine Fresher rested in beautiful and strong clothes, sat in the living room, and drank coffee waiting for her sister. James came into the room and stopped, leaning on his crutches. He looked at Mom and asked Aunt Christina, "Where is Mom?" "I wanted to ask her something." Nancy was taken aback. She looked herself up and scrutinized her son's face. "James, what's wrong with you? You don't recognize your mother." A look of intense surprise appeared on the boy's face. He wiped his eyes shut and opened them sharply. "Mom, it's you. Who else? Honey, what are you doing?" Nancy got up restlessly from the couch and walked over to her son, checking to see if he was okay. The boy looked a little confused. "I thought you were Auntie, Christina. Have you become so much like her?" Nancy smiled softly. "Of course we look alike. We're twins." "Well, yeah. James, come closer. I know it's just that you two used to be so different, but now you look exactly the same." The woman smiled and couldn't believe her ears. She was insanely pleased to realize that she looked like her sister again. Nancy remembered how upset she had been when she had seen her the day they arrived. She happily noted to herself that she felt like herself again. "Was there something you wanted to ask me?" Nancy asked. "Do you remember when I used to go out on my own? I met some of the other guys then. Do you mind if I go out alone with them again? There are older boys there. If anything, they'll help me." Nancy still feared for her son, but agreed. She took James' phone numbers from his new friends and told him to give them hers just in case. She finally realized that you can't deprive a child of his childhood, and his illness is not a barrier. You can always find a way out, and not to shake and be afraid of every step. After walking her son to the gate, she returned to the living room. Christina was already there. "I thought so." Nancy said to her, "It's very nice here, of course, but I have to get on with my life. I can't stay with you forever and live off you. Anyway, it was time for me to go home, find Kevin, and finally deal with my mother-in-law, if we still have her." Nancy's voice trembled. "That's right." Sister Christina nodded approvingly. "But maybe you can do it later. James is so nice here. I'd love to. But you can't keep dodging problems forever. Are you right?" Christina's thinking. "Listen, why don't you leave James with me? He and I will work things out just fine. And he told me yesterday that he's made some friends here." "Oh, I hadn't really thought about that." Nancy was visibly nervous. She'd never left her sick son unattended in her life. He's not too stressed out. "What on earth are you talking about?" Christina waved his hands in surprise. "You know how much I love my nephews. I'd love to be with James. Go deal with your insufferable mother-in-law. Go find Kevin. I miss him just as much." Nancy thought for a moment. She knew she couldn't put it off any longer, but she didn't want to leave without James. After many minutes of thought, she finally nodded and agreed to her sister's suggestion. "You're right. I'll go home tomorrow. And I don't think James would mind staying here." Christina looked at her face. "How's it going, sis?" "Keep it that way." Nancy was standing at the gate. James, when he heard that his mother was coming back, had offered to leave him with his aunt. He was glad when he found out that Mom had already made that decision. Now the son and his sister came out to see her off. They hugged each other tightly, and Nancy was just about to go out. But James called out to her, "Mom, wait." The boy approached the woman and looked her seriously in the eye. "Can you get Kevin out? I'm so anxious to get him back to the way he used to be." Nancy was immensely surprised at her son's words. After all, the brothers had been getting along very badly lately. She put her hand on his shoulder and answered just as seriously, Yes, I promise, kissed her son on the forehead and started down the road towards the station. A serious conversation with her mother-in-law was waiting for her on the train. On her way home, she tried calling her eldest son again, but all in vain. The teenager was still not answering the phone. The situation was the same with her husband. The woman did not dare to call her mother-in-law. She thought it would be better to talk to her face to face. When she finally reached her entrance, she suddenly realized that she was still afraid and did not want to plunge back into her problems. What if the mother-in-law has already rented our apartment to someone? The woman thought, what if Frank is there with some woman? What if the worst guesses were worse than the worst? Tortured Nancy. Finally exhaling and pulling herself together, she went up to her floor. Barely opening the door, she stood still in horror. She was startled by the harsh listening noise coming from the apartment, from her own apartment business. She didn't know what to think. Opening the door with a quick step, she stepped inside and stopped like a stumble. The place was a complete mess. Right in the hallway stood a stepladder from the wall, collected wallpaper, all around in some paint cans. It took the woman a few seconds to realize that her apartment was being renovated. Her mother-in-law's voice came from the kitchen. Still ringing and annoying, Nancy shook her head, shaking off her shock, almost hitting a paint can with her foot. She walked into the kitchen and experienced an even greater shock. Standing next to the window was Kevin, her oldest missing son. He was holding a large paint roller. He was painting the ceiling with confident strokes. Clara, sitting nearby, whom Nancy hadn't noticed in the midst of this spectacular sight, called out to Nancy, "It's you?" Asked her mother-in-law. Her tone was one of joy and genuine surprise. "I don't recognize you. I thought Kevin, your age, had come to see us." Clara laughed loudly as usual. Kevin turned around, smiled, and said, "Hi, Mom." Nancy couldn't believe her eyes. Her oldest son was alive and well and looking better than ever, and yet he was at home doing repairs. "Where were you? Why didn't you answer?" "I could barely get it out. My mother was dumbfounded too. I was here. My grandmother and I are making repairs, and my grandmother turns out to be a real piece of work. World history. Odds." Kevin looked proudly at his grandmother, and the latter did not stay in debt and winked at him in a cocky way. He didn't answer. Kevin continued his monologue. "At first she just didn't want to talk, and then I lost the phone. How are you? How's it going?" Nancy came closer to the goats, looked at her son closer. Surely he's not a trick of the eye. Nothing wrong with him. Just in case, she gingerly touched his leg. She couldn't reach any lower. "Everything is fine," Nancy smiled cheerfully. "I come with good news to add to the conversation," cutting Clara. "Well, well, what's the news?" "James is having surgery in September," Nancy said excitedly, not hiding her pride. "And it's free." "Nancy, I can't believe what I'm hearing." Clara rose from her stool in delight. "But how?" Her daughter-in-law smiled modestly and answered her, "I'll tell you all about it later. It's a long story. James and I just made some useful acquaintances." Clara nodded. Nancy caught herself thinking that her mother-in-law looked as if she knew it would be like this. Clara said, giving her voice an instructive tone, "See, all it took was a little change in your habits and some rest." She looked at the kitchen. "All right, you can tell me all about it later. In the meantime, you look at what the little one and I have already managed to do." The woman came out of the kitchen, beckoning her daughter-in-law to follow her. Together, they proceeded to the bathroom. Seeing what became Nancy here, thought she had fallen into a fairy tale. She simply did not recognize her bathroom. The sink was new, perfectly clean. The once so annoying to Nancy shabby pipes were gone. In their place was a new silver towel drying rack. The bathroom itself was lined with shiny coffee tiles and a dimly dull light bulb. Shade-less lampshades were replaced with bright, spotlights. The once shabby and dirty green walls were done and painted above the tile in a nice color. Nancy on the favorite. By the way, everything was so fresh, so clean. The restroom adjacent to the bathroom had been given a complete makeover too. A new toilet bowl, tiles smooth and fresh, painted walls, a neat hanging cabinet for household supplies. Nancy simply stopped comprehending what was happening. She only asked quietly, glancing at her mother-in-law, Clara, "How is that so much money? Who put that nonsense in your head?" "The one with the smirk." The woman asked. "I withdrew a little from my savings account. We live frugally in the village, we have our own money. But it's not as expensive as it may seem. We spend only on consumables and plumbing, and that's the simplest one we took, and everything else we did ourselves with our own hands." Clara put her palms forward, as if demonstrating the truthfulness of her words. "Come on, I'll show you something else. We've already changed the wallpaper in the nursery. No offense, but we're not in the bathroom yet. We're sleeping in your bedroom with Frank." "What do you mean, Clara?" Nancy said with delight. And she added, "How did you get my Kevin to participate in the renovation?" "I couldn't even get him home for the last 6 months. And you have to have a different approach for each one." The mother-in-law began to lecture her daughter-in-law again, but this time Nancy didn't mind it at all. She listened attentively to her brave relative as she proudly boasted of the new renovation. As Nancy drove back to town, all sorts of terrifying scenarios swirled in her mind. She imagined her husband having an affair with his mistress. She imagined Kevin setting up a real brothel in the apartment. She imagined many things, but she couldn't imagine her mother-in-law making the renovations she had dreamed of and bringing her eldest son home. Nancy was over the moon. She quickly changed her clothes and started to help her family with the renovation. Together, they finished sawing the ceilings and painted the walls in the kitchen and glued special panels on the apron of the kitchen set, which, by the way, changed the fronts. Mother-in-law found somewhere on the sale, as she said, for pennies, a little used knot and previous owner's oak fronts. Yes, from the very real, fresh, smooth oak. The miracles continued. Over the next few days, the renovation of the apartment continued in full swing. Nancy watched Kevin cautiously at first, trying to see if his son was off drugs and alcohol. When she was convinced that her son was completely sober and was preparing to pass his tails at school to move up to the next grade, she almost lost her mind. The overjoyed mother wanted to ask Kevin about everything. How he had managed to quit his bad habits, how he had decided to leave his awful company. But Nancy was afraid to alienate her newly found eldest son. With unnecessary questioning, she was happy to communicate with both Kevin and her mother-in-law. And the repairs were no burden at all. One warm evening, Nancy, suddenly remembering that she was on her way to find out about her mother-in-law, sincerely apologized to her. "For God's sake, Clara, I apologize for accusing you then without reason?" Guiltily, said the daughter-in-law. She now really thought that she had just heard that phrase. The mother-in-law graciously forgave her suspicious daughter-in-law. "I understand. She's Nancy. You were creepy back then, weren't you? What tired looking. Scary, by God." She answered her, and both women cried and hugged each other tightly. During these few days in the joyful bustle and cares, Nancy suddenly realized that her mother-in-law was not at all such a nasty old woman. Yes, she was a little peculiar, of course, but not mean at all. Now Nancy was anxious to ask Clara about her husband. Where he was, why he wasn't answering his phone, but she didn't dare. Embarrassed. After a few more days, Nancy felt that it was time for her to return to work. No matter how well her life was going, she still needed the money. And she missed her clinic, her colleagues, and even her patients. She had warned George in advance that she would be coming to work soon. Nancy was already standing at the reception desk. Lily, the receptionist, did not recognize a colleague. "So nice and fresh." And Nancy looked. "How nice to see you." George greeted his assistant with joy. He carefully pulled out a chair in front of her so the woman could sit down. He walked over and sat at his desk. "You look great, just great." The man left approvingly. "Thank you." With gratitude in her voice, Nancy replied. She changed a little, but dared to say what she was thinking. "You know, I was angry with you at first, terribly angry. But you were so right about everything. I really needed that vacation. Sure, it took a little longer, but I really got more rest than ever and solved a lot of my problems. I can see that very well. I see it now," the doctor replied, smiling broadly. "Like children. Like a young son." "George, you won't believe it." And Nancy told the supervisor everything that had happened to her in the last 2.5 months. The dentist listened to his assistant attentively and occasionally asked clarifying questions. It was obvious how genuinely happy he was for her. "Now that you have rested, fully regained your strength, I have to confess to you," said the doctor, a little embarrassed. "What's the matter?" Nancy moved forward, expressing concern. "It's that my temporary assistant is an idiot." The doctor laughed good-naturedly. "I've missed you as a professional and as a friend too. I hope you will be able to take up your duties very soon." Nancy went back to work. Her attentiveness was enviable. Each of the patients again, as before, noted the woman's neatness, her carefulness, and her focus on her work. Her mother-in-law and her son-in-law, who had successfully passed all the transfer exams, were waiting for her at home. Her eldest son. The renovation was slowly coming to an end. In the evenings after work, the woman helped her loved ones and cooked something delicious under the careful guidance of attentive Clara. And on the next weekend, she went to her sister's villa to check on her youngest son and share the latest news. When Nancy returned back to the apartment, she caught sight of a man's shoes in the hallway. They were her husband Frank's shoes. The woman walked breathlessly into the kitchen. Nancy's soul of mine, Frank, broke out in a wide smile. His eyes shone. He looked better than ever, and most importantly, he was completely sober. "Frank," Nancy was at a loss for words. "How are you? How's your work?" "Fine," the man replied, proudly raising his chin. "Nancy, how good do you look, as good as you did 20 years ago?" Frank moved closer to his wife and hugged her tightly. The woman stood motionless. She couldn't believe that her Frank was completely sober. For the past few years, he had never returned from a watch so fresh and trim. Such a turnaround was a true miracle for the family. She said quietly and shocked as why did you what happened? Frank laughed. "It's like this. I don't drink at all anymore." And he hesitated, quickly walked out of the room, and just as quickly came back in. "This is for you." Smiling broadly, he bore his wife a gift box. At this, Nancy opened the present with interest and was surprised to find there a new bright ceremonial clothes and a small jewelry box. The woman opened it and marveled. Inside were small gold gems with some kind of green pebble at the base. "But how do you like it?" the man asked with a gasp. "I do." Nancy covered her mouth with her hand in admiration. She hugged her husband and poked him on his clean-shaven cheek. She ran off to try on her new earrings. Frank, who had followed her, continued talking, and also this to Vanya. "I bought new sneakers, James. I want to give you a new computer, but I don't have enough money. And also a beautiful red dress." The woman took an example of earrings and immersed herself in front of the mirror. Then she turned to her husband and slowly walked in front of him, modeling gait. The couple laughed in unison. Nancy, not hiding her curiosity, asked, "Why have you changed so much? I've been praying for you for so long. And now it's so easy." Frank laughed again. "Well, I've got a steady job now, a good one. I'm not a fool to push through an opportunity like that. And when my wife is so beautiful, kind, affectionate, how can you trade her for alcohol?" He took Nancy's hands and pulled her to him. "In fact, ask my mother, you shouldn't have disliked her." He winked slyly at his wife and left the room. Nancy thought deeply. What did he mean by that? She turned back to her family on the wall and surveyed the newly renovated kitchen as if anew. Clean, smooth walls, new kitchen cabinetry. Even the refrigerator was new, big, spacious. Nancy had always thought appliances were very, very expensive. But the wise Clara suggested that they could be bought cheaper. For example, a used but still decent item, or you could pick up a good discount at the store. Nancy couldn't. She looked at her apartment, at her family, and still couldn't believe everything had worked out so well. She looked at her mother-in-law carefully. She was laughing, telling an old joke to her grandson. Nancy noted to herself that her mother-in-law's loud voice was not at all obnoxious, and the jokes were silly. Clara noticed her attentive gaze and came closer. "I see you want to ask something." She smiled slyly. "Okay, you can ask your questions. Let's go out on the balcony. Let's not disturb our men." The women quietly went out of the kitchen. When the balcony and the door closed, Nancy immediately pounced on her mother-in-law with questions. How? How did you manage all this? Frank promised you would tell me what you did. Cher, repair Kevin. Sober Frank, I don't understand. Clara laughed out loud. I realized a long time ago, my dear, that there was something wrong here, didn't I? The last time Frank came to see me, I knew right away. There's trouble in my son's family. What's next? The woman asked quietly. What? I had to take matters into my own hands. I don't know your character. Don't take offense, but you're too softly warm, daughter, and not flexible at all. I came here to give you a real beating. I'm sorry again for what I said to you, but you really needed to go away and get some rest. But how did you know I was going on vacation? I could have gone anywhere. Nancy asked. Clara laughed merrily again. I'm telling you, knowing you like the back of my hand. Where else would you have gone? And your sister? A wise woman, I know. She wouldn't give you bad advice. Look what you've become. And all you had to do was nothing. Why? That way you could have just said, oh really? My mother-in-law's hands are splayed. I never told you. You did every time we called, but you didn't listen. I mean, you did. I mean, I didn't really hear you. So I had to do it on the sly. And I faked that conversation too. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I didn't hear that, Nancy said in surprise. Yes, and slyness itself. Nancy smiled broadly. But how did you wean Kevin off the drugs? How did you do it? How? Did you have to act like you did? Tricky. Later, Clara smiled. I told him that some beautiful girl was looking for him, that she'd made a date with him and given him the address. There was no pretty girl, the woman inquired. Good point. And the address was an addiction clinic, the one at the church. There I showed him when he arrived what could happen to him if he didn't quit that stuff, and then I arranged for his treatment. He was there for a month and a half, which is why he hasn't returned your calls. They're not allowed to use the phones there. Believe me, dear Kevin, I get it. He'll keep studying and everything will be fine now. Just one thing. Nancy looked at her mother-in-law with undisguised admiration, and that I promised my grandson I'd have a serious talk with you both. Tell me, why are you forcing him to study economics? Kevin's dream is to go to gymnastics school. You know how much he loves soccer, right? I know, but no. But my mother-in-law interrupted Nancy. Just because you don't like your kids' choices doesn't mean they're wrong. You're right. No matter how short-sighted you think he is right now, it's his life, you know? It's his own, and he has to choose his own path. And you and Frank should just go along with it, help support him. Everybody has their place in this life, honey. And success can only be achieved by doing what you love. Nancy thought deeply. She was well aware that her mother-in-law was more right than ever. But it was hard for her to admit it out loud, so she only asked quietly, what about Frank? And Frank was the easiest to guide to the true path. Why was he drinking? Because he wasn't happy. I promised him that very soon you and his wife would stop being such a bun and start supporting him. You will. Of course I will. Good for you. Our parishioners helped me find him a job. One of them has a rich relative who needed a reliable security guard. I told my son that this job was his only and last chance to get his life together. You see, now on that tender wife, happy children, a favorite house and a job is all he needs to be happy in America. And he's not the only one. It's not much at all, is it really? You're right about everything. I'm sorry again. So how did you help James? Who is this Leo of ours, really? Nancy's mother-in-law laughed out loud. You're the one who helped James. I had nothing to do with it. Although, if you want my opinion, I think it's your new temper. Tell me before, you would never ever talk to a stranger. You see, it can be good to relax a little, put things in perspective. You're right. Thank you, dear Mom. Nancy, without hiding her emotions, threw herself into Clara's arms. Now she couldn't believe that her mother-in-law's once-hated visit had transformed her life. You're welcome. Daughter, it's been almost a year since the events described above. James, the operation was a success. The boy recovered easily and was able to walk again without crutches. Like all normal children, he started to go to school. He had a lot of new friends and new hobbies. Kevin finished 11th grade very well. Not without a C, right? But we can't all be great at math, as the family joked, and he entered, as he dreamed, the physical education school on a budgetary basis perfectly prepared. He passed all the necessary standards, just brilliantly. Passion for sports helped him to meet a good and simple girl, and the old company and bad habits the guy forgot forever. Frank, in turn, completely abandoned drinking. He worked hard, was well regarded by his superiors, and by the end of his first year, he was promoted to shift supervisor at an important facility. Nancy was happy. She worked at her pleasure, did the household chores, spoiled her sons and husband with various goodies. The family had paid back all their debts and were now living in complete prosperity. The happy family now divided the summer into two parts. The first half they spent at Christina's villa, and the second half in the village, at her parents' at Frank. It turns out that to be happy is very simple. The main thing is to be open, optimistic, and necessarily able to love. It is important not to put your hands down and be able to look at your problems from different sides. Such qualities will definitely be rewarded. After all, the main thing in life is to be able to this very life and really enjoy it.
Subscribe and click the bell. Any other woman would have been hysterical, but Lisa didn't even cry. When the door closed behind Sebastian forever, only all the days after he'd left, she'd been tormented by a strange sense of guilt. According to the law of the genre, she should be feeling something else entirely. For example, self-pity and hatred for her husband. But no, Lisa's soul was completely calm, and only sometimes a shallow calm ran through the sea. That unpleasant feeling. She kept thinking about the fact that Sebastian would not have left if she had. And then there was a dead end, because the mind refused to answer the question what I had to do to make him stay. All the last few days, Lisa had been trying to answer that question for herself. She realized that her own life and the fate of her children depended on it. The young woman mentally tried to solve the intricate crossword puzzles, patiently going over in her mind every day, which was remembered by something. The small car her parents had given her for her 30th birthday moved confidently through the streets of the evening crash city. It seemed that she was now driving not a stylish hatchback of obscenely bright red color, but her own life, and everything depended on which way she turned at the nearest intersection. Her hand unconsciously reached for the control panel, and a life-affirming tune blared from the speakers. Lisa began to sing along with the singer in some wild performance. The woman did not have vocal data, but it did not prevent her from singing heartily and even making risky vocalizations. Probably, her miniatures were too loud because passing cars persistently honked. But these signs of attention only added to the excitement. "Guys, I'm fine. I'm fine." From the speakers poured booming sounds, and the accident regretfully said aloud, "Good, but not good enough. I never thought I was capable of doing such a thing. But I'm ready to do it again, and I don't care about public opinion. That's the way I've had to keep it all my life. I've had to look up to the best. I don't want to be second best anymore. I'm gonna prove to him that I'm worth something." This vivid monologue, worthy of the best stage, was addressed to Sebastian. These words must have been on my heart for a long time. But after they were voiced, Lisa felt relieved. Only a sense of her own guilt, pity for the little business trips from behind hid in a far corner of her soul. "It's okay, I'll deal with you. I'm strong." Father from young Nails brought up in his daughter the best qualities. He often told his daughter it's only when she's young. Their life seems endless, and by old age, people consider every day they live as happiness. So try to do good and useful deeds. She didn't understand the meaning of those words. "Daddy, why do that? To keep every day in your memory. You'll remember it later in life. This day I helped an old lady, and the next day I saved a bird. Daddy, when you cheat, is it a good deed or a bad deed?" Such questions of his daughter put David in a deadlock, but he never avoided answering. In general, Lisa thought he was very lucky to have his parents. They were the best people on the whole earth, and every day of her distant childhood was filled with their care and warmth. Funnel was the late child in the family. David and Miranda were already at a ripe old age when they decided to join their fates. Both of them had the first unsuccessful experience of family life, so they met for almost 3 years before applying to the registry office. To the appearance of a new addition to the family, the spouses were also preparing very responsibly. The future mother strictly followed all the recommendations of doctors, and the future father attended special courses, although at that time to such events men were very skeptical. At work, some men even frankly laughed at him. Our future father is well done. Maybe and give birth together with his wife will go. If I have to, I will. And there's nothing wrong with that. At that time, giving birth together was a novelty among us. So not everyone welcomed such an undertaking, and the male half of the population was outraged by this prospect. Sometimes both husbands and fathers gave such a forecast about this imported innovation that it would not take root in our country. They are all going crazy in Europe in pursuit of equality and freedom. We have other traditions, and everything is clearly distributed. Women give birth, and men bring up and earn money. Although one could argue with the last statement, no one dared to deny the inviolability of tradition. Therefore, David's bold decision remained unfulfilled, and the moment of accidental birth father did not see. However, this circumstance did not reduce the joy of the newly minted father on the last cash. And then the salary was given once every few months. The man hired artists from a house of culture and brought them in a broken-down Jiggly right to the house. The mini concert under the windows of the medical facility made a strong impression not only on the young mothers, but also on the staff. Some nurses even wept from excess of feelings. Such love is only shown in movies. What a good man. Of course, Lisa understandably does not remember the events of those days, but my mother loved to tell this touching story. And each time there were new details of her first days of life. When they brought you for the first time for feeding, I was even scared. That day 8 boys were born and only 1 girl. All the boys are so big-faced and screaming at the top of their lungs. My little girl looks like a Zamora in front of them. You didn't even scream. You promised like a kitten. Although Miranda spoke fondly of her daughter's shortcomings. In her early days, Lisa was not exactly pleased that her mother compared her to an abandoned kitten. It was only later, when she herself gave birth to her first son, Kevin, it became clear that for the mother the appearance of the child does not matter. But life is a very harsh thing, and it does not spare even small children. If for her parents the girl was a miracle, people around her did not think so. The first time she faced injustice in kindergarten. That day is forever. In memory, on the eve of the first holiday of spring, children prepared gifts for their moms. In addition to cute crafts, it was decided to please women with a small concert. Educators put together a program and engaged in the distribution of numbers. Then, for the first time in my conscious life, showed initiative. Let me learn a song or a poem. I'm good at memorizing. One of the teachers looked at the child strangely. It's not enough to memorize well. You have to have a pretty face. How about you? Lisa saw another teacher pushing her colleague hard in the side. What are you talking about in front of the child? Nothing out of the ordinary. I'm just used to telling the truth. Let her get used to it. She'll have to hear many times in the future that she looks like a mouse. So gray and unassuming. Of course, Lisa, her 3.5 years old, did not understand the whole meaning of what the educators said, but her memory was really good. When her mother came to pick her up in the kindergarten, she right in front of the teacher who condemned the appearance. The girl recounted everything from herself. The girl added, I was not even given a poem. All the other children were given to other children. And I speak well and sing loudly. And Kelly has a cough, but she's beautiful. And now she will sing the lead song. Lisa cried with resentment. The teacher was ready to fall through the floor in shame. Miranda tried to speak calmly, though her voice trembled with indignation. What kind of castings are you doing here? Who allowed you to cripple the psyche of children? I won't let it go. I'll go to the education department tomorrow. Lisa and her mother were not present at the party. The teacher, who had distinguished herself by her unworthy behavior, didn't show up in their group anymore either. One could rejoice at the triumph of justice, but they still tried to hide behind the backs of their comrades. When it came to important events, she remembered the first day of school life. By this time, the girl has already internalized the rules of human society and did not seek to demonstrate her talents. She by habit dissolved into the crowd of peers because in the general mass were not so noticeable her chicken ears and colorless eyebrows on her freckled face. The ceremonial ruler passed without a hitch, and she joined everyone in beating her hands joyfully. When a tall high school student carried on his shoulder a first grader who had a symbolic bell in the shape of a big bell in her hand. Of course, in her heart Lisa envied this girl because she really wanted to be in her place. But she realized that with her unattractive appearance, it was impossible. When the children went to their classrooms for their first lesson, an unfamiliar boy from the senior class, pointing his finger at her, yelled, "Guys, watch a walking horror movie." Miranda was very afraid for her daughter, but she said with a nonchalant look, "Mom, the boy probably wanted to call me a contestant because I have really big ears. He just mixed up the words. Don't worry, I'm used to it, and don't take offense." Lisa overheard her mother telling her father about the outrageous incident. "David, I'm so scared about the funnel and why everyone's picking on it. Looks pretty normal for a kid to me." "Miranda, don't worry. Your Soar Lisa is the best and the most beautiful, and she's a strong-willed character for a 6-year-old. That's what scares me the most. I'm afraid she won't become violent. There are many such stories when childhood complexes lead to terrible consequences in adulthood. I'm sure Lisa won't have complexes. She is a very bright girl and quickly learned the rules of the game. Appearance is a matter of time. We will see with you the miracle of transformation of an ugly duckling into a beautiful swan." Unfortunately, her father's predictions did not come true, and Kelly never became a beauty. But her unassuming appearance no longer frightened anyone. And by and large, everyone at school did not pay attention to it. The fact that the girl was excellent in all directions. She was sent from the school to the Olympiads in various subjects, and she always returned with a victory. Especially, she remembered the day of the next triumph, when she in the intellectual competition left far behind even high school students. But it was a pure victory. That day was one of the happiest in Lisa's life. The 8th grade student became the pride of the school. She was shown on TV programs and even written about in the regional newspaper. But fame is a short-term phenomenon, and she understood it perfectly well. She also realized finally that intelligence and knowledge are even more important than appearance. On the day of receipt of the certificate, no one remembered the Wright's Reno appearance teachers predicted her promising future. Classmates with undisguised envy looked in her direction. The first beauty of the class, whose certificate was a solid 3, deliberately loudly said, "Lucky some people. She herself is nothing." And it was her who got the gold certificate. Who's the unlucky one? Lisa earned her gold honestly, and you got a second-hand certificate because you're like the dragonfly in Krylov's fable. I envy you. Lisa will be welcomed with open arms at any university. How would you like to get into any mediocre college? The parents watched their daughter from the sidelines, and both cried tears of happiness. "Miranda, what a wonderful daughter we've raised." So many nice words have been said about Lisa today. I must tell you, dear wife, that I have never been as happy as I am today. David, today is also the happiest day of my life. Not even on our wedding day have I felt so good in my heart. There was one more person, or rather a girl, who was sincerely happy about Lisa's successes and sad that she would no longer meet her in the school corridor at the big recess. Such feelings on that sunny June day were felt by Cindy, for whom Kelly was even more than a friend. All people fall into 2 categories. Some are genuinely happy about their friends' successes. Others only pay lip service to such feelings, But deep down, they envy and dream of revenge on the lucky ones. Lisa had her enemies too, but all the attempts of detractors to put the excellent girl off balance failed. And when she accidentally discovered a mouse in her school backpack, contrary to the expectations of the organizers of this action, she did not run in. She put the animal in the palm of her hand and even stroked the mouse on its back. Subsequently, the mouse was released by Lisa to freedom. Some giggled behind the girl's back. The fisherman sees the fisherman and the mouse smells the mouse. In simple terms, a man will not hurt his own. Next time, one of the jokers smeared the chair where the best student sat with carpenter's glue. But this adventure didn't work either. Lisa noticed the suspicious glint from afar, and by the tense look of one of her classmates, she unmistakably deduced the author of the prank and addressed him with a request. "Robert, your chair's a little higher. I'm not comfortable in this one. Let's switch." The boy blushed, which the teacher took as a sign of shyness. If a girl asks, a real man has to give in. After that, Robert had nowhere to retreat to, and he sat glued to the table for a whole horn. Then his friends long held him off the furniture, but still his pants could not be saved. After lessons, the Cossacks were waiting for Lisa near the school. "You think you're so smart." Lisa laughed in the face of the Cossacks' loser. "You know about the law of boomerang. That's what you got. You're laughing too hard. Sit down. Next time, we'll have a different conversation. Consider it your last days, and I've turned on the Kozak counter with your math skills. You are sure to say goodbye." The girl laughed again and headed home. She heard Robert shouted after her and clicked. "The one who laughs last always wins. Now it's my turn." In 5 minutes, Lisa had forgotten about her classmates' threats, but 2 days later she had to remember Robert's words. In order to save time, Lisa, like many kids in her neighborhood, walked through a small park. It wasn't a popular place with the townspeople, so everyone tried to get past it as quickly as possible. Lisa also quickened her step when she found herself in the park. She noticed from afar a group of teenagers near the fountain, which hadn't been working for a long time. A group of teenagers. It was too late to retreat, and Lisa didn't allow herself to show any weakness. She quickened her pace even more, hoping to get past the enemy cordon. But Cossacks blocked her way. "Well, forces, who are we going to laugh at?" The crowd of spectators cheered. "Maybe we could bathe her in the fountain. But it doesn't work. Then how shall we punish her? Guys, I've got an exclusive for our best student. You see, there are buildings with the letters P and G. And G, Robert, you're the man. People are hungry for a colorful spectacle. By the time the accident happened, I realized I should have gotten out of here. It was too late." Teenagers surrounded her, then took her under the arms and dragged her through a street toilet. She screamed at one of her abusers, even kicked him in the eye. But the forces were clearly unequal. From somewhere off to the side came Kaya's girlish scream. Then there was the sound of a heavy blow, followed by another scream. But now it was one of the vigilant hordes. Lisa didn't have time to realize anything as the battle cry sounded again, and another offender began to writhing on the ground in pain. The rest of the trio slipped away from the scene. Bavaria looked, round your eyes, at the girl about 12 to 13 years old and could not believe that 2 defeated opponents is her handiwork. The young judoka held out her hand. Cindy paired up and accepted the friendly gesture as, "This is where I from school happen to be. I always walk through the park. So, anyway, I heard you screaming from a distance and rushed over to help. Say, Cindy, where did you learn to do that?" Suddenly the girl was embarrassed. "My daddy taught me. He used to be a champion. But then he broke his arm and had to retire from big sports. He's a coach now. I've been training for 6 years. I'm already a blue belt, and soon I'll be a brown belt." Although Lisa didn't understand anything about sports ethics and martial arts, she stretched out meaningfully. "Great." The girl named Cindy was pleased with the praise. "I've been wanting to meet you for a long time, but I've been hesitant to approach you. And now I'm here. Forgive me for asking why you hesitated to approach me. You're an honor student, and you're a year older than me. Cindy, you're adorable. Does age and other little things matter when people are friends? The enchanted girl looked at Lisa. You'll be friends with me. Of course, now I just have to repay you for saving me. You realize I don't mean money and stuff. Maybe you're having trouble in some subject. Cindy jumped for joy. I'm failing math. I can't get my head around cosine and minus. Oh, don't feel bad. I'll help you. We can start math class today. From that day on, Cindy became a frequent visitor to the powerhouse. The girls worked out at 2 o'clock every day, and then drank tea with delicious cones that Miranda prepared for them. But most of all was happy David. It's very good that you have a real friend. The girl corrected her father. Dad, you mean friend, not daughter. I said what I meant. You see, those words with the same root have slightly different meanings. You can hang out with a friend, talk to her, share your feelings, but only a friend can protect you. This girl, Cindy, is a true friend. I hope I'm not wrong about her. David made the right prediction about Cindy. The girl who grew up in an athletic family had strong-willed qualities and was always open to contact. She never paid out herself, although she also had something to be proud of. Soon about the girlfriends began to talk about a pair of goose. Yes, Gagarin, though both God has offended in terms of beauty, but the ambition above the roof. The girls did not pay any attention to the words. All the more they did not feel inferior. Thanks to good upbringing and clear understanding of life goals, both schoolgirls had already been formed as individuals. Therefore, they treated such conversations exactly as an adult perceives children's mischief. The only thing they regretted was the upcoming separation. But the girls found a good way to remove this obstacle. Lisa applied to Baumanka to specialize in software engineering and nanotechnology. These were completely new directions, and many guys dreamed of getting a profession of the future. That's why, for the first time in her life, Lisa had to fight for a place with equals, because among the applicants there were almost only medalists. There was a treacherous moment when the girl almost gave up. She called Cindy to get some advice from NATO. You have no idea how many medalists there are per square meter. I'm even scared. Her friend answered her calmly. It's normal to be scared. It's bad when people panic. You sound like you're on the verge of despair. I just don't understand why you're panicking. I'm scared too, when I go on the tatami and I don't know my opponent. But that's the philosophy behind any fight. Overcome fear and win. In your case, it's much easier, because you have to overcome your own fear. That's it. Lisa successfully passed the additional tests and was admitted to the faculty. The first year in any educational institution is considered the most difficult, so she spent all her time studying. But the workload, as the student of a prestigious university liked to say, did not prevent her from talking to her friend once a week. During hour-long conversations on the phone, the girls told each other about the main events, shared their plans. In one of these sessions, Cindy joyfully told Lisa, I decided to enter Sekhanov at the Faculty of Sports Psychology. So very soon we will be able to see each other in person. That's great. But what about big sports? You dreamed of winning championships, right? Girl, you're the one who told me I had to be realistic about what I could do. So I did, and I realized that playing for school is one thing, but playing for the country is another responsibility. In short, I'm not up to the highest level, and the term of sports life is too short. So I decided to devote myself to another useful business. After all, to train future champions is also an honorable business. Although in the voice of Cindy slipped sad notes, it was clear that this was the girl's final decision. Lisa decided to cheer her up. Perhaps it's true. You have to plan your life with an eye to the future. And I'm very happy for you. Cindy got into university on her first try, although the girls' grades weren't very good. But the merits in sports played a decisive role. This period was distinguished by another surprising event that brought the girls together. Between their parents, there was something very similar to friendship. After all, common concerns and experiences unite people, like many girls her age. Lisa also secretly dreamed of a big and beautiful love. In her school years, she read popular novels, in which there was more tragedy than happiness. Then for days, the girl walked under the impression of the book she had read. True, she did not share her experiences with anyone. Even with Cindy, she did not speak on the subject. And the reason for this reticence was her appearance. Although Lisa got used to the fact that everyone considered her a dunce, and her being did not want to put up with this state of affairs. Therefore, the girl began to experiment a little bit with cosmetics, and it turned out pretty good. Cindy was very well versed in makeup, and the lessons of her friend went in favor of a moderate appearance. After entering the university, the girl forgot about the fact that her appearance does not meet the standards of beauty. In the first place, it was not up to it here. In the second place, most of the female students were similar to Lisa, and many girls wore glasses with reinforced lenses. It was this circumstance that helped to finally forget about her disadvantage. During one of the meetings with a friend, Kelly decided to touch on the taboo topic. Cindy, you probably have a lot of suitors on the course. You're so fashionable, and you dress boldly. The friend looked at Lisa strangely. Lisa, I'm surprised at your naivety. You're only a year older than me. At our age, a year doesn't matter. That's true. But I didn't mention age by accident. Haven't you realized that life is basically a struggle for a place in the sun? It's a natural selection process set in motion by nature itself. You know very well from school biology that the strongest survive in this process. Otherwise, they just get crushed. In order to get to the finish line, you can use any means. That is why mimicry is widespread in living nature at all its levels, including human society. Lisa looked at her friend for a long time with wide-open eyes and could not come to herself from surprise. Was she really the stubby girl who was good at wrestling? No. Now she saw before her an educated, self-confident girl who could philosophize freely. Cindy, I never cease to be amazed at you. Where did you get all this? You wouldn't believe it, but it's your school. I used to catch every word you said on the fly. And you've convinced me day in and day out that knowledge is the basis of everything. And of course, my future profession has a lot to live up to. Yeah, well, I'm in a good place when it comes to dates. Why did you ask me that? I don't know. No reason, I guess. I mean, at our age, you're supposed to have a boyfriend, Cindy remarked to Lisa with winning irritation. I don't recognize you. Where's your old confidence and optimism? What's age got to do with it? Lisa tried to control her excitement, but the excess of feelings and did not allow her to control herself. Cindy realized that without a good shake, she wouldn't say anything. She roused herself with a battle cry and playfully put her friend on her shoulder blades. But honestly, it's funny to watch you stay like a gymnasium girl. She laughed, and the inner stiffness disappeared. You picked up an unfortunate comparison modern gymnasium girl and anyone 100 points ahead will give. I just used to think that relations with the opposite sex are, to put it mildly, a closed topic for me. This is bullshit. You're the one who made the setting in your head. You just have to flip the switch and enjoy life. I knew from a series of unspoken phrases that you had something going on the personal front, and I wasn't wrong. Lisa exhaled with relief. I had hit the bullseye. Yes, I have a young man, but for lack of practical experience, I do not know how to behave with him. Like naturally, you don't have to come up with clever moves. If you really like a person, tell your secret hero. Do you like it? A sort of blissful smile appeared on the girl's face. Cindy, I don't know exactly, but I think I do. He makes me feel at ease. We can talk about anything. And honestly, I don't want to leave him. That's a very good start. And that's how love most often starts. But you shouldn't lose your head. The warnings of a friend flew by and didn't settle in the mind of a woman in love at the Mariinsky. That she was in love with Sebastian was beyond any doubt. Their first meeting resembled a plot from the novels they had read earlier. The second-year student needed to prepare an essay urgently, so she went to the university library. Sebastian was already hard at work on a similar assignment at a neighboring desk. They had crossed paths in the confusing labyrinths of the university before, but they didn't know each other intimately. This time, when Lisa appeared, Sebastian greeted her with a gesture. She answered the guy with a nod of her head with her neatly styled hair in braids and pigtails. Engrossed in their work, the young people did not notice how it became completely dark outside the windows. The reading room was empty. The librarian asked them several times to leave the room, but they asked for another minute. Realizing that her entreaties had no effect on the fanatical students, the woman turned off the lights. It was unexpected. The young people were confused and tried to find a way out in the darkness. But in an unfamiliar room, obstacles in the form of chairs, tables, and other furniture were at every turn. Sebastian laughed. And I now feel like a hero of a computer game to go to the next level, which there is a strict aunt waiting behind the door. You and I will have to hit a dozen bumps. Lisa was amused too. Their predicament is not easy. But if you and I don't make it in time, the scoreboard above the door will light up and we'll be stuck here forever. So we have to hurry before the nice lady locks the door. Give me your hand. With two of us, it'll be easier to get around all the obstacles, and we'll get an extra shot. The young man shook the girl's hand firmly and was the first to enter the path of the unknown. Immediately, the rumble of falling furniture was heard. Immediately, the light flashed, and in the doorway there was a formidable silhouette of the librarian. What on earth are you stupids doing? Sebastian nonchalantly answered the question with a question. Why did you turn off the lights? You thought we might break arms and legs in the dark. How many times do I have to warn you? What could I do if you don't understand Russian words? Lisa had no idea that a dialogue of just questions could be so interesting. In the end, the very unkind aunt promised to complain about them to the dean's office. Our university is for decent people. Such famous scientists have studied here. And you. We still have a long way to go. Who knows, maybe 10 years from now, you'll remember how you kicked out 2 Nobel laureates from your library. And believe me, you will be very ashamed of your bad deed. Sebastian gave the lady a bow, bewildered at the confusion, and they ran laughingly out into the street. Now I must see you off. Such a vivid acquaintance requires continuation. You don't mind that? Excitement filled soul and body, and Lisa in a joking tone replied, if we all started the game together, then, logically, we should move to all subsequent levels together. You know, that's a very apt comparison. But still, I really want our relationship to grow into something more than a computer game. I mean, we're not painted people. We're real people. I'm not against this development either. But there is one thing. The young man looked at the girl with surprise. Let me guess. Are you married? No. Then you're an alien. And your space transportation is coming for you right now. Also no. Then I give up. We haven't even met for sure. But now we're gonna make up for it. Besides, I know your name is Lisa. And I'm Sebastian. Lisa laughed heartily at the jokes of the guy, and from this on her face, there was a blush in her eyes, daring and sparkling. The young man openly admired her. Lisa, if you only knew how beautiful you are. I have never met such a beautiful girl before. It was the first time Lisa had ever heard such words, and she felt dizzy with happiness. After only a few weeks, Kevin and Sebastian felt a strong attachment. The young man, in his usual joking manner, explained this phenomenon as follows. Lisa, you and I are lucky to have met each other so quickly. Have you heard the beautiful legend about the novelties? Of course I have. And you're saying we're part of the same whole. Do you think otherwise? It's just that we're not scattered around the world like the others, but we're dumped in one place. I guess it was the end of the day, and they had no other option. But that could happen if we don't take the chance the angels gave us. Sebastian, you're always talking in riddles. Isn't it enough that we meet every day? The girl felt the same loving gaze of the young man again. He gently drew her to him and kissed her. I don't want to date enough. I want more than that. I want to see you every minute, to feel your breath. Lisa was silent, and anxiously awaited the continuation of this love song. But Sebastian concluded his confession succinctly. "Let's get married." Sebastian. "And school? And what will we tell our parents?" "Lisa, listen to me. You and I are adults, and we have to make our own decisions. Is a passport stamp a barrier to getting a diploma? Probably not." "Exactly. And tell me, why should you and I be held to a standard? Don't you want to do something without being prompted to make important decisions yourself?" "Sebastian, I'd like to, but how would we live normally? Trust me, there are no problems that can't be solved. My parents got married when they were students, and then I came along a year later. But that didn't stop them from getting an education and successfully moving up the career ladder. Imagine how surprised everyone will be when they find out that you and I are already a family. Perhaps it was the desire to surprise everyone that drove the young people when they decided to get married in secret without saying a word to anyone. They applied. Spring came and the whole world was born in blooming outfits. The hearts of the two lovers were also filled with spring feeling. Only on the eve of the important event, Lisa told everything to Cindy. Her friend couldn't come to her senses for about 10 minutes. "Lisa, have you gone mad? And how does it manifest itself? Well, for example, tell me, what are you going to go to the registry office in jeans and a t-shirt? And instead of a photo in your head will be adorned with a baseball cap with some stupid English inscription on it." The bride's confidence faded a little, but she didn't give up. "You make it sound like I have nothing to wear. I have a decent, classic suit and a good pair of shoes. By the way, I came to you hoping to find support and help. Did you? And I owe you an emergency fix for your shortcomings. Tell me, what sins do you give your parents for? Don't you get it in your formula-filled head? What's the most important event in their lives? The wedding of their only daughter. I don't know how things are in Sebastian's family, of course, but I'm sure his folks would be shocked too." Clara realized that her friend was right. "And what would you do if you were me? I'll never be in your shoes, because I'm not that frivolous, but I would advise you to reschedule." "No, Cindy, they say it's bad luck." At Cindy's insistence, the newlyweds-to-be urgently called their parents to make sure the wedding ceremony was as good as the others. They had to use a rental service, but the parents of the bride and groom never fully came to their senses. They hardly understood what was going on. Therefore, all questions had to be settled by Cindy. When the perpetrators of the commotion and put their signatures in the registry office, David, not without irony, asked, "And where do our newlyweds plan to spend their honeymoon?" Lisa and Sebastian looked at each other in confusion, but the new husband was more resourceful. "We'll pass our exams and go on a construction crew." John liked his son's idea of family life. "When I was his age, I was just as bold and brash." By the way, not a bad option for newlyweds. It's all about romance, living in tents, mosquitoes, shared meals, and a lot of very hard work. The man turned to the bride's parents. "I'm the one who's teasing their offspring about me. I got married when I was a student." Christina, Sebastian's mom, contributed to the discussion of an important issue. "John, that was a very different time. And now, look at all the ugly things going on around here. Sometimes you don't want to look." Miranda was agreeing out of a sense of female solidarity, and only David remained silent. The newlyweds sat quietly, silent. The important event was celebrated in a small restaurant where there was no one else but the wedding party. Sebastian's mother continued to express her dissatisfaction with modern life, but she was clearly bringing the conversation to something more important. Finally, she easily pushed her husband away. "John, what are you all agonizing under your breath? You're not going to let our children wander around in tents, being eaten by merciless mosquitoes." John glanced in the direction of the newlyweds. "Christina, a construction crew is great. It's a great option for extreme athletes. If they're so independent, let them deal with their problems from now on and take responsibility for their rash actions." "But John is our only son," David calmly said. Friends, let's raise our glasses to the young ones, even though they have put Piggy in our hands. Let's forgive them that little thing. Advice and love. Cindy cheerfully shouted bittersweet. After the toasts in honor of the newlyweds, Kevin's father took the floor again. My wife and I have decided to take care of their lodgings. I've already booked a hotel room for 2 nights. Now we just need to find a cheap place to stay. They can't go to a hostel. John shook his head and repeated for the 3rd time in one evening that his son went to him. It's not for nothing they say genes don't set a finger, for I am a son. Thank you, brother-in-law. I fully support you. Frankly, I really do not want to send their construction team somewhere closer to the swamps, but by the example of matchmaker forced to show mercy. We'll organize a trip for 2 to somewhere tropical. For the first time all evening, the newlyweds have raised their voices. Yay, we're going on a real wedding trip, although not without adventure. Their married life began romantically, but the sweet period ended quickly and flowed these than later. Gray everyday life. The pitfalls of family life began to appear at once, although the parents always kept their shoulders in readiness to set them up in time. The young couple had a hard time. After all, lectures, credits, and sessions were not combined with a normal family life. And then there was pregnancy. Baranki forced to adjust plans for the near future. The future mother's well-being caused alarm, and Sebastian decisively stated we must take an academic. But the parents of the young couple were categorically against such a decision. Christina especially insisted on continuing her studies. In no case should we take a break in their studies. Then it will be even more difficult. Miranda supported Sebastian's mom. I'm going to take a well-deserved vacation in a few months. Of course, I still wanted to work, but for the sake of the children I will go as I should. I'll help them. Let them study, and I'll take care of my grandchildren. The young couple accepted such a generous gift with delight. But as time went on, more and more sacrifices were required. Kevin and Sebastian saw them as an obligatory step on the part of the older generation. Parental help made their lives so easy that after Kevin was born, they decided to have another child just 3 years later. This time there was a girl, in whom both grandmothers did not devote their souls. Miranda and Christina practically lived in the house of their children. What caused dissatisfaction with the men? John was the most resentful. Christina, how many times do you have to coddle them? Don't you think our children are sitting on our heads and feet shining? The woman tried to resist, but it was obvious that for several years she was very tired. John, I understand your outrage, but who's going to help them if not us? Sebastian is traveling alone with 2 kids and a job, so let her quit her job and take care of her family. John, think about what you're saying. What are they gonna live on? You should have thought of that before. Besides, Sebastian makes good money, and if you moderate your appetites a little, you can live on his salary. Lisa, she's very talented and has a brilliant career ahead of her. A woman has to choose between work and family. Christina resented it. All these years living with you, I didn't realize, John, that you hold such beliefs. Lisa's parents also argued about it. Only the discussions weren't as heated. But despite the frankly dependent behavior of young people, the parents made more and more sacrifices on the altar of their family happiness. Meanwhile, the relationship between the spouses had also cracked. Sometimes Lisa did not recognize her husband. She could not understand where his cheerfulness and trademark jokes. More and more often the head of the family came home irritated and, not to spoil anyone's mood, locked himself in his office. The family has long since replaced the rented accommodation on their own house in the Moscow region. The purchase of real estate helped parents, although from the outside everything looked prosperous. But intuition told Lisa that the family structure of her happiness is not strong, and it is about to collapse. And soon the woman received confirmation that her premonitions did not fail her. When Sebastian returned from another business trip, she began to sort through his things as a habit. No, she found no traces of lipstick, and from the shirts of her husband did not emanate the scent of French perfume. But a small business card with a Kathy's phone number on it flew out of his pants pocket. It was not in the woman's plan to cause a jealous scene, and there weren't many women with that name in the world. After all, between this and the unknown Kathy and her husband could be simply a business relationship. Driven by the best of intentions, she put the blue card in the most prominent place. But the woman hadn't expected such a violent reaction from her husband. Sebastian shouted and waved his hands in indignation. "Didn't expect you, wife, that you rolled over to something as trivial as checking my pockets." The woman was dumbfounded by such an onslaught. "Sebastian, why are you yelling at me? That card just fell out of my pocket, and I don't recognize you lately. You haven't been the same." Scared by the parents yelling, Kevin came out of the nursery. "Mom, are you and Dad fighting?" "No, son, we're just talking. The girls said you were fighting, so I thought I'd take a look." "It's okay. Go to your room." The man calmed down a little, but he decided to set the record straight. "Lisa, I'm warning you if I see anything else." The woman's eyes darkened, and she wished she had followed Cindy's example. Now she wanted to scream at her husband, but she stifled her anger and cut off the torrent of threats and reproaches. "Don't you ever speak like that again. This is a warning." It worked on Sebastian, but from that day on, the relationship between the couple deteriorated completely. So Lisa decided not to tell Sebastian that she was pregnant again. Women did not lose hope that they're in a cozy home again shines star happiness. Not for nothing in the people say that trouble never walks alone. Tense relations in the family and unresolved issues with the third pregnancy supplemented another unpleasant event. No sooner had the New Year holidays died down than Sebastian's father called. "Son, urgently come with Mom. She is in intensive care." Jean did not explain over the phone what had happened, but from his tone Sebastian realized that the situation was serious. He threw to his wife, "I'll take the car." "Sebastian, but it's dangerous. The roads are icy. It's better to take the train." The man looked at his wife as if he wanted to live her with his eyes. "Don't you realize my mom's in intensive care? She's not well at all. Please don't yell at me. I'm worried about you. I'm sick and tired of your unrelenting concern." In the morning, the accident found out that Sebastian didn't make it. His mother-in-law died of a massive stroke without regaining consciousness. The husband took this loss very hard. He completely withdrew into his grief and stopped even communicating with his children. But Lisa had to urgently solve the issue of her pregnancy. It was impossible to postpone it. When her husband returned late at night, he found Lisa in the living room. He grumbled unhappily, "What are you doing up so late?" "Sebastian, we need to talk." "Not this. Can't you see I'm falling asleep? I'm not celebrating either. I have a life, and I've got kids on my hands. You don't take an interest in their affairs, and they resent you, especially Kevin." The man sank down tiredly on the couch next to his wife. For a second, it seemed to Lisa that everything was back to normal. Sebastian drew his wife to him. "I'm sorry. I've been hurting you a lot lately. But it's the cost of our existence. My mom's death has taken a toll on me. Sebastian, I understand. I'm not myself sometimes, but we can't do this alone. That's for sure. Our moms have been a great help, and now we have to make it on our own. It's okay, we can do it. The older kids are big." "So stop, Lisa. You said older kids. What does that mean?" "I'm pregnant, and I need to do something about it, because I'm critical." The woman didn't expect the news to send her husband into a frenzy. "It amazes me that you're a grown woman, and sometimes you act like a 5-year-old child. Don't you realize we don't need this child? Why did you wait till the last minute?" Tears, resentment, and hot streams flowed down my cheeks. Against her better judgment, Lisa began to justify herself to her husband. "Well, you're always walking around, disgruntled. I was just afraid to approach you. I was waiting for the right moment." Then disaster struck, and one thing led to another. Sebastian pointed to his wife's stomach. "That's where the real disaster is. You shouldn't have let this pregnancy happen. But let me tell you, I wasn't the only one involved. I get the feeling sometimes that you do things on purpose to spite me. Sebastian, how can you say that? It's our child together, and it's certainly not his fault. I'm not going to argue with you about this, but my decision is clear. You need to get rid of this pregnancy. We've had enough of 2 children. The next day, Lisa was in for another blow. She went to the clinic, and after a checkup, the doctor said, "Sweetheart, you're too late. Your due date is a good 14 weeks, and you'll soon feel the stirrings. So you're gonna have to have this baby." Well, my husband doesn't want to. I can't help it. What are you so afraid of? I can see from your story that you're not poor. Does another baby really burden you? Children are our joys. They are our continuity. After her doctor's appointment, Lisa decided to visit Cindy. She lived across town with her husband and her son Ivan, who was a year younger than Kevin. When she saw Lisa, she was overjoyed. Oh, how many years, how many winters. What wind brought you here? I heard you had an accident. I'm sorry for your loss. All these obligatory Cindy phrases, I said it once. Only then did she invite her friend into the house. Tell me what you've come to tell me. I'm having another baby. Well, that's great. You're tearing up. Sebastian is totally against it. He ordered me to get rid of this pregnancy. Life changes people beyond recognition. I mean, not so long ago, you were such a nice young man, a real role model. I watched your touching relationship and dreamed of such love. Clara shared my worries with my friend, and at the same time paid on her shoulder. Thank you, Cindy. For what? For what you are. Oh, come on. You don't have to worry too much about men. They're all like that, and you can't change it. You just have to know how to turn the situation in your favor. I don't know what you're trying to say. Well, for one thing, have a seizure or something. Make him worry. Thanks for the advice, but I can't do that. Suit yourself, but stop by if you need anything. Sebastian seemed to have forgotten about his conversation with his wife. He would leave again for business trips and then return, always in a bad mood. Bavaria tried to keep her balance for the sake of the children's peace of mind. The woman diligently threw wood into the almost dead fire of family happiness. But the fire did not want to ignite. 2 months passed and the growing belly became visible even under loose clothes. Once at dinner, my husband said with apparent calmness, "You still did your own thing." Sebastian, it was too late. No one wanted to do the operation. Isn't there any other way? Herbs and pills. Lisa was horrified. You're an educated man, and you're offering me medieval methods to get rid of your own child. If anything happens to me, have you thought of Kevin? The man was embarrassed. He realized he'd said something unnecessary. I'm sorry, I really did say something mean without thinking. Things calmed down for a while. In the summer, she gave birth to another baby boy in a bar, and Sebastian was even happy about his wife's gift. It's a coincidence that father and son have the same birthday. Christopher will grow up. We'll celebrate together. By the time he grows up, you'll be a grand old man. That's the wrong answer. I'm only 33 now. That's the age of Christ, which is symbolic in itself. They sell hard liquor in the store at 18, and the fact that doing some simple math, you're 51 years old, and that's the best age for a man. For the second time in the years of marriage, Lisa observed a miraculous transformation, always nagging, whose husband, that former Sebastian, with whom she was easy and cozy. With all her strength, women tried to keep this fragile happiness. After work, Sebastian spent the whole evening with little Christopher. He played with him and rejoiced at his son's successes. Kevin also took an active part in the upbringing of the youngest member of the family. But this family idyll did not last long. Soon Sebastian started coming home at night again. One day he disappeared for 2 days. Her imagination painted the most terrible pictures, and Lisa began to call her husband's friends and colleagues. But no one knew where her husband had disappeared to. She already wanted to call the police to start a search for the missing man. How did Sebastian show up on his own? He brushed off the questions of his children, who were also worried about their father, with irritation. And he lashed out at his wife. "You're making a big fuss and scaring the kids. I'm scaring the kids. You disappeared from the house without a word to me. You could have called me. Or don't you care about anyone? Lisa, you're just annoying me with your habit of making things worse." Another woman would have realized the cause of our problems a long time ago. You're in naive ignorance, or pretending not to understand because it's more convenient. I'm sorry, what am I supposed to understand? Well, I'll tell you, but no offense. I'm sick of this gray existence. Look at yourself in the mirror. Haven't you ever been told you look like a gray mouse? You're not even trying to change. I'm sick of mediocrity. I want bright colors and bright feelings. She looked at Sebastian and couldn't believe it was him, her beloved husband, saying such hurtful words. "Sebastian, come to your senses. What are you talking about?" "I've already come to my senses, and that's why I'm leaving." The man took out a travel bag and began to throw his things into it. Lisa couldn't move. She could not believe that this was happening to her. "Sebastian, what about the kids?" "Don't worry about the kids. I'm taking care of them. And by the way, I'm being very noble because I'm leaving the house to you." "Where are you going?" "I mean, where are you going to live?" "That's none of your business. I've met a woman who makes my heart beat." With a confident gait, Sebastian headed for the door, but when he remembered something, he turned around to get the rest of his things. "I'll come back tomorrow. And don't try to look for me. We're breaking up for good. It's best for everyone." The door slammed. A minute later, there was a mighty roar of the engine, and the black SUV disappeared into the darkness of the winter night. "Mommy, Daddy left us." The daughter looked at her mother, fear in her eyes. "How are we going to live without Daddy now?" Kevin took his sister's hand. "We'll be fine. There are still real men in the house. Mom, if he comes, I won't let him in." Lisa, still hoping for the best, tried to soften the drama of the situation. "Son, you can't talk about Dad like that. He's not a father. He's a traitor." It was only a few days later that Lisa fully realized the extent of her personal catastrophe. Everything was falling out of her hands, and the children demanded a mother's care and attention. 1.5-year-old Christopher was particularly vulnerable. So Lisa was left with nothing else to do. "How do I call Cindy?" She rushed over. "You meet the rescue team. We'll stay with you for a couple days until things settle down. Have you called your parents?" "No, it's not right to bother the old folks. Then when things calm down, we can tell them everything. Who knows, maybe your Sebastian is the right guy." "Okay, I won't talk in front of the kids, but as a rule, most unfaithful husbands. Then beaten, humiliated, they go back to their nest. Sebastian's not coming back. You're almost 100% sure. So there's still a little hope for the return of the prodigal parrot." "I'm sorry. I didn't think it through." "Well, we'll see. Our head of household is at a training camp, so we're gonna be loud and happy. We're gonna stay with you guys. We'll save on utilities." Cindy winked at her friend, and she smiled at Cindy. "I'm amazed at your ability to see the bright side of every situation, because I'm an optimist, and you need to do something about it. Otherwise, you're a mess." From that day on, Cindy took full responsibility for her friend's house and its tenants. She advised Lisa to take a vacation to get used to her new surroundings. Cindy actively set about transforming her friend's life. "Lisa, you need to completely change all your settings. I know it's hard, but you have to try." Lisa tried to resist the over-exuberant activities of her savior Nice. "Listen, Cindy, I'm about to turn 33, and I don't think it's possible. What you're suggesting. I agree that you have to do something about your appearance. You can buy fancy clothes, but how do you change yourself on the inside? If you want it bad enough, you can do anything. Motivated people who can do things that you can't believe. Of course, it's hard to do it alone, but I know someone who can help you." Lisa's alert. "I didn't think you'd send me to a therapist." "What's wrong with that?" People sometimes don't realize the seriousness of their problems. A competent therapist can determine the depth and cause of the problem at a glance. No, I'm not going. Calm down. I have a friend of mine. We study together. He specializes in women's problems. But if you don't want to go, then I'll leave you alone. But I'd like you to do it. Trust me, you'll thank me later. And I have to think about it. So you can ride your mind-blowing car and think, and we'll cook dinner for the starving elves. Kathy enthusiastically bounced Cindy and me around, having so much fun. What are elves? They are very small people, but they can do all sorts of wonderful things. They can even turn people into bugs. Well, they can only do that to a bad person. And with Aunt Betty, the women looked at each other. Who's that? Kathy looked at her mother and her friend as if they were bugs. Like you don't know. Aunt Betty is Daddy's girlfriend. I saw her when Daddy and I went to the store to get food for Christopher. She had black hair, but I didn't like her. Cindy was interested in Kathy's story. Why is she mean? No, she's faking it, telling me how cute she is, but her eyes are evil. My mom is 1,000 times prettier. Lisa's daughter's compliment made Lisa's heart feel better. Okay, Cindy, I don't want to hear any more about doctor's aunts. I'm going to take your advice and go for a little breeze. Over 2 o'clock, Lisa circled the town. She sang songs, talked to her husband, who treated her for some Aunt Betty with black hair. And all the resentment of a silent night, she came home. The children were already asleep, and only Cindy was waiting for her in the kitchen. Well, blowing off steam. Thanks for the advice. I'm feeling remarkably light right now. I'm going to take your option. I really need to change my life completely. The trouble is, the grayness has gotten into me and won't let me change. Lisa had never been so worried. She was waiting for her turn in a soft chair, more like a big ball, with the same soft, dim light pouring down on her from above. The atmosphere was very comfortable and the tension disappeared, but the door opened. A tall man in an expensive suit, the color of wet asphalt, invited her in. Come in, please. Your friend and I are longtime buddies, and Cindy filled me in a bit on your history. Lisa nodded and felt a treacherous shiver run through her body. The man sat down across from her so that his brown eyes took in the full spectrum of the view. Don't be afraid, I'm not a real doctor. Who is? Simply put, I'm a problem specialist. I know where they hide and how to deal with them. That's all. Isn't that enough? See, you've even stopped shaking. That's a good thing, so we can communicate more easily. Lisa, I should introduce myself, Charles. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. I love the company of women in general. But it's not because I'm a sucker or a slacker. It's just that there really is a mystery in every woman. Sometimes she's the cause of serious problems, and you know how to solve them. Do you always succeed? I'm not gonna lie to you. Not always, but a lot depends on trust. If a client trusts me as a specialist, a positive result is usually guaranteed. And how long will the treatment last? And how much will it cost me? Lisa, this is not a treatment in the direct sense of the term. I have been dealing with the problems of modern women for a long time, and I have my own system of solutions. No medications, all surgeries and other types of influence will not threaten you either. Then what is the point? You and I will try to find the key to your personal mystery, which is hiding inside. Although she didn't fully understand what Charles was saying, she was intrigued by his proposal. I agree, and I'll do whatever you say. That's fine. Then from tomorrow, you start keeping a diary. Buy a general school notebook in the Department of Goods and write in it all your thoughts, fears, worries. Be sure to record events in the house family and at work. In other words, write down in a notebook everything that comes to mind. And what will come out of it, we will see together later. But I'm sure it will be entertaining. Did you like to write essays in high school? Yes. I wrote for half the class. I couldn't say no, even though I knew it was wrong. And you blame yourself for that? Yes, a little bit. My husband left me with 3 kids and I can't shake the guilt. I'll definitely help you. But first, you have to get creative. Lisa bought a notebook and a whole pack of pens. She thought Charles was very strange. But she decided to try his method on herself. At home, she opened the notebook and froze. Her mind was completely blank. She took them away. So Lisa, what's next? And then it occurred to her that the first entry should be a description of this very fear, the fear of the white sheet. When Lisa looked up, she realized that it had been 2 hours, no less. Lisa looked in amazement at the notebook, in which at least 20 pages had been written down. What a mother you gave me. She quickly turned off the light and went to bed. Memoirs are memoirs about sleep and work. In the morning, Lisa almost overslept. But she had no panic. She ran merrily around the house. Pushing the children up the stairs, Cindy's lurched Cindy appeared. She watched her friend in amazement. Var, what's the matter with you? What are you carrying yourself like a propeller? Oh, Cindy, good morning. Come have breakfast with us. Cindy kept watching Lisa, while Lisa was simultaneously dyeing her eyelashes and telling Kevin what to buy after school. When Lisa arrived at work, she realized that she was missing her notebook. It turns out there is so much going on around her, and she hadn't seen it before. Now the woman in her head instantly compiled her attitude to what was happening, and very much did not want to forget it all. Take, for example, their janitor. He smiled every morning, but invariably without opening his mouth. She used to think it was just a peculiarity of the man. And then it turned out that the janitor just had a constant breathalyzer. Lisa had disliked him, but someone on the staff said that that transition hurt the whole family, so it's easier for him to live like that. The week flew by. Cindy looked with interest at how her friend in the evenings diligently writes something in a notebook. One day she couldn't take it anymore. Look, you look like a schoolgirl. All that's left is your tongue. Lisa laughed. You know, I was so fascinated by what Charles suggested that I think I might write a book. Cindy sat down across from her. So what's the deal? Go ahead and write it. Oh, come on. What book? Cindy calmly poured herself some water from a glass. I can't see why not. But Cindy, I'm not a writer. No answer accepted. No one is born one. A writer is immediately given. Oh, come on. Who cares about the experiences of a gray mouse? Cindy grinned. I've never understood why you don't like yourself. Do I? Why don't I love myself? But her friend didn't let her finish. But look, you know perfectly well that you have the most ordinary appearance. But you're smart and could not fail to realize that nowadays you can make anything out of such appearance. It's only worth spending a little money on a makeup stylist. Next, everyone always predicted you a stunning career, but you had Sebastian at the top of your list. I can't understand why. And now you didn't even think about what I said. You just said you couldn't do it. And why didn't you answer my question? Lisa was, frankly, confused. She hadn't expected her friend to say that. Cindy. Why Cindy? Who would tell you all this if not me? Lisa stared confusedly in front of her. It seemed the shakeups in her life were just beginning. She wrote even longer today, writing about herself, about Cindy, about their meeting, about the fear that was in her as she was dragged to the street bathroom, fell asleep with notebook in hand. The next day, she had to visit Charles. She waited again in a kind of frantic excitement, and when he sat down in front of her, she immediately calmed down. But what? How are we doing? Don't be shy. Tell me. Even if you've only written 4 pages, that's already progress. Lisa suddenly laughed. You know, Charles, until I started writing all this down, I was sure I was living a boring, gray life. Now my confidence is shaken. A man suddenly said, Lisa, has anyone ever told you? What a charming smile you have. No, I don't know. I don't remember. She was embarrassed for some reason and put the notebook in front of him. He took it in his hands, looked at her in surprise. Oh, you're good. What's up? Let's deal with what hasn't stopped gnawing at you. Lisa shook her head. You know, I'd like you to read this without me. And then maybe we can talk about it. Well, that's fine. You don't think you're done yet. Do you have more to write? She nodded her head. I never realized that there are so many different big and small events around you if you don't just list what happened in a day. And if you reflect on it, you sometimes come to the most unexpected conclusions. That's good. Tell me, has your attitude toward any of these events changed since you wrote about them? Lisa nodded. I saw a lot of things from the outside. You know, it even seemed to me that I could change some things, help some things. So what is it? Don't be afraid to offer your help. Don't be afraid to do things you haven't done before. You're about to change, aren't you? They talked for about an hour. Charles didn't seem to say anything, but she felt really energized. Lisa ran into the store and wanted to buy a notebook, but after some thought, she decided to get 3. If she barely had enough for a whole notebook for a week, how much more would she need? No one knows. She walked out and wanted to go to her car, but the sign for the Lily Beauty Salon caught her eye. She had always loved lilies. Lisa hesitated. She always went to the same hairdresser, the same manicurist. Then she walked resolutely to the car, put the notebooks on the seat, and closed the car. "Hello. Come in, please." A woman of her years looked at her, except she was bright and interesting, and even though her hair color was a little off, and her lips a little brighter than decorum dictated. But the woman was a real eye-catcher. After Lisa sat down in the chair, the woman asked, "What are we gonna do?" "No." You know, Lisa turned to her. "I'd like to change things. I've had enough of this." "Oh, that's very interesting." She turned Lisa to the mirror and stared at her reflection thoughtfully as she continued talking. "I studied and then worked in the Capitol. I studied not just to be a hairdresser, but a master of images. Then I fell in love and got married. I moved here. But apart from the details, no one here wants to do anything chemical. No, don't think I regret anything. I love my husband very much, but sometimes you just want something like this. Wedding images are the only thing that takes a little professional pressure off. That's it. I know what I have to do. My name is Adriana, by the way." 200 hours later, Adriana turned Lisa over to the mirror. "I didn't jump right in. That's enough for your first makeover. Something tells me you won't stop there." Lisa opened her eyes and almost cried out. It was her, and it wasn't her. Her hair had turned a very dark chocolate color. But when I move it, there are strands of light color peeking through here and there, a couple shades lighter. It makes it look like a really thick head of hair. Adriana had them done, and now they were shoulder length and very successfully covered the ears. The eyebrows were terminated as if they were the natural shade of your lashes, as if you had thickened them. I didn't put makeup on you. In the first place, it would be more of a shock to you. And secondly, I think you look great. Lisa finally got some air. "And this won't wash off." Adriana laughed. "Well, of course not. But I would advise you to come back at least once a month to renew the light." Lisa stepped out of the salon and saw Charles emerge from the building across the street. She smiled, waved at him, and got into her car. Lisa herself did not know why her soul sang like that. Lisa entered the house. Apparently Cindy, along with the children, had plotted to blow it past. Kevin whizzed by. Somewhere in the other room, Lena was squealing and Cindy was laughing. Then Kevin came back. "Hi, Mom." He stood there staring at her, stunned. He was called out of the room several times. He didn't answer. Then Kathy's head appeared in the doorway. "Hi, Kathy." She didn't finish. She looked at her mother as if she was seeing her for the first time. Cindy, having waited for no one, also appeared in the hallway, followed by the youngest members of the two families. Cindy exhaled noisily. Wow. Lisa was getting a little uncomfortable with the feeding. "Is anyone going to feed me?" Everyone made a lot of noise. Kevin and Cindy rushed into the kitchen, and Kathy came over to her. "Mommy, you look beautiful." "Thank you, my sunshine." Dinner was a lively affair. It was probably the very first night that no one remembered Sebastian once. As soon as Lisa entered the office, there was complete silence. "Good morning." Cindy had, of course, warned her that there would be a reaction, but Lisa had never imagined it would be this strong. Until lunchtime, her coworkers only squinted at her and occasionally asked her something work-related. And just before lunch, their famous heartthrob, Robert, approached her. "Lisa's, I was wondering if we could have lunch together." She looked up at him in surprise. Robert had never liked her, despite the fact that the entire female population, the offices, those under 30, just slept and saw themselves next to Robert. And he was really good, tall, moderately muscular, always dressed in style, and in a way that emphasized his masculinity. And he was also pompous and shallow at work. He did his job and didn't care about anything else. But that's Lisa's opinion. "Thank you, Robert. I'm fine. I'm having lunch alone." She smiled charmingly at him and inwardly froze with horror. How could she do such a thing? Such a handsome man. Just for paying attention to her, and therefore giving her confidence, she must not only dine with him, but also pay for those lunches. Robert stared at her in amazement. The coworkers chuckled quietly. It was especially funny to those whom Robert had already dumped. He walked over to his desk and sat down. It was obvious that the young man was at a loss and just didn't know what to do next. Lisa had already gotten up to go to lunch when the secretary entered the office. "Lisa, you are in charge." Lisa was scared out of habit and almost sat down. But then she thought, why should she be afraid? Her work is in order. No one's private life should be anyone's business. Rick called. "Sit down, Lisa." I didn't. He asked me to come in. Lisa sat down, not understanding what the man in charge wanted from her. "Lisa, I've been keeping an eye on my employees. And you know, you've always made me happy. And when have you ever not been broken by family problems? I'm sorry, but I'm aware of that. So it hasn't affected your work in any way. I realized you were exactly the person I needed." She asked. "I'm sorry, but I'm a little confused." "Needed for what?" "My deputy took a well-deserved vacation. I can't do it alone, of course. No one wants to live on the job, and you have all the prerequisites to take this position." Lisa was a little taken aback. Just like that, to be deputy director. At least she had the education to do it. But for some reason, she hadn't even thought that she could really make a career out of it before. Now it's right in front of her. Grab it and enjoy it. She refused. "Rick, I really appreciate the offer, and I know I can do it. But in case you haven't forgotten, I have 3 children. To give you an answer so I don't let you down in the future, I need to talk to my parents. You realize if they can't take on at least a junior, I can't take you up on your offer. That's what I like about you. You're sensible and sober, and that's worth a lot. And I'm letting you go home tonight. Work out your problems. Talk to your parents. I'll see you tomorrow with an answer." Lisa caught Cindy packing. "Where are you going?" "Var, I'm sorry. My husband's coming back. I'll visit you often, but you know he won't understand my absence." "What's wrong with you? You're all disheveled." "Yeah, I came in early." Lisa told me about the boss's offer. Cindy reached out. "What can I say? Girl, I believe in you. I'm sure everything's gonna be okay now. The only thing left to do is to believe in yourself." Lisa looked up at her friend. "I do. I almost do." They hugged goodbye. "The most important thing is that you go like this. Don't give yourself time to beat yourself up and dig into yourself." Lisa laughed. "So how are you doing with your friend Charles?" Cindy gave her a sly look. "Speaking of which, why did he call me and ask me a bunch of stupid questions that were all about you?" Lisa was confused. Maybe what she wrote is the ramblings of a deranged person, and he wants to make sure so he can send her on to treatment. I ran away, my friend. In the evening, the children gathered in the kitchen. "Mom, what's the occasion?" "Yeah, Grandma and Grandpa are coming over." Kevin looked at Kathy, then at Mom. "But they don't know about Dad. They'll find out. Are you guys gonna help me or not? We're all going together." They had just had time to set the table when the doorbell rang. Miranda immediately began to reread it. Jesus, it's only been a little while, and you were waving like that. And Daddy looked at Lisa. Daughter, I can't even recognize you. What's the matter with you? A new life. He chuckled and walked into the room. Oh, we're getting a royal welcome today. Miranda turned to Lisa with her daughter. We forgot something. The woman was frantically going over birthdays and other dates in her head. Mommy, come in. You haven't forgotten anything. Everyone sat down at the table. The youngest, as usual, climbed into grandfather's lap, smiled. What about champagne? David looked at his daughter more carefully. I know you too well. Tell me what happened. But Miranda intervened. Where's Sebastian? He hasn't been home lately. That's no way for a father of 3 to behave. Kathy started crying. Kevin took his mother's hand. Lisa stroked his head. Thank you. It's okay. Mom, Dad Sebastian left us. David quacked. Even slammed his fist down on the table like he killed a cockroach. Miranda clutched at her heart. Mom, it's okay. We're getting used to living without him. I've gathered you for an entirely different reason. The woman looked at her daughter in amazement. How can you say that? You have to bring your husband back into the family. David wrinkled his nose, but didn't interrupt his wife. Mom, I'm not going to bring anyone back. It was his wish. He's happily living with some new woman. I filed for a divorce today, but I need your help. Daughter, you know that. I was offered a new position today. She said Daddy was admiring her. He said his daughter would show everyone. And gray mice are capable of something, especially since she looks different today. She doesn't look like a gray mouse at all. Her parents offered to move in with her for the cold season. The kids need to cook. And it's getting dark early. Mom, Dad, I never dreamed you'd help me so much. The next visit to Charles was on a weekend. Clara looked at the 2 scribbled notebooks with a smile. Charles was right. As soon as she wrote her problem, her fear, on a blank sheet of paper, it didn't seem so big. Charles didn't have to wait this time. He was waiting for her in his office. Lisa, I have a suggestion. Let's talk somewhere else today. She froze. I can see how scared you are. What is it? And she laughed out of the blue. It's my surprise. It's my pleasure. They were sitting in a cafe overlooking the park. Autumn is a beautiful couple. Charles looked at her. You've changed a lot. And not just in appearance. You know, I even regret resisting Cindy. The man smiled. Cindy, you can't resist. You must realize that. Sooner or later, we were destined to meet. Tell me, I've read your diary. Is it true she saved you like that? Yes, I myself still remember her screams and her enemies lying there. Of course, it's impossible to describe in words. No, you're wrong about that. You write in such vivid language. It's as if I imagined myself there. I even had an itch to break up the whole bunch of assholes. No way. I didn't even realize I'd written it, to be honest. I wasn't thinking on purpose. Lisa, I was wondering if I could show your diary to someone. He's some kind of rich philanthropist, writer, hermit. I can think of a lot of other epithets for him. I promise, if you don't want to, we'll stop anytime. Stop that. You know, your notes would make a very good book, a guide to action for women who've lost themselves, written in artistic, very clear language. But I am a person far from all this. That's why I would like to show your writings to the pros. Lisa was expecting anything but this. Oh, Cindy, didn't she put the idea in Charles' head? It doesn't look like much, though. It's good to change, so change everything. Let's give it a try. This is great. That's just great. Lisa, let's use the first name, and we should drink champagne for that. After the cafe, they took a long walk. Charles told how little always stood up for justice, got for it in kindergarten, at school, and at home. Lisa laughed. Did they teach you to be fair? No, on the contrary. I guess I don't have a good temper. They tell me. And I'm still, I think, razor sharp. Say, Lisa, Could we go to the movies or the theater with you? It's so hard to meet a woman who's interesting to talk to. I've had a lot of women come to see me, but frankly, I think of them all as patients. I can't think of you. I've never been to the movies. Clara wondered. When had she ever been to the movies? Probably when she and Sebastian didn't even have Kevin yet. I haven't been to a movie in a long time. It's beautiful. No, not that you haven't been to a movie in a long time. It's that I'd love to take you. One evening, Miranda asked Lisa if Sebastian had called. Lisa turned to her in surprise. No, why would he call? Well, anyway, I met him by chance yesterday at the mall. He was with his girlfriend, but there was nowhere to hide, so he had to say hello. So it's his what? No, you know, I felt sorry for him. No, I don't mean that. I don't mean that. He was confused, scared. Lisa was about to answer, but then she didn't. She knew perfectly well that her mother was worried about her. That's what a mother is. Charles had disappeared. I don't know where. After that trip to the movies, he brought her home and kissed her. She responded with such fervor that there was no way they could break up. Apparently, the man is all the same smart, weighed all the pros and cons, decided that 3 children for him too much jam, blamed him. She was sure it wasn't because she was a gray mouse. The doorbell rang. The mother looked up. Who is it so late? Lisa went to open it. But as soon as she opened the door, she was surrounded. So she was frightened. Lisa, he takes over everything and the proofreading and the publishing. He's sure it's going to be a real bestseller. Charles, put me down immediately. Charles set it down on the floor and looked at the household who were speaking of the commotion with embarrassment. David looked at Charles. I understand we need to set the table for tea. The young man will tell us who he is and why he is carrying our daughter around like that. An hour later, the father paced nervously around the room. I knew my daughter was being watched by everyone. But Lisa, we are all with you. Keep that in mind. She was confused. Actually, her profession doesn't tolerate any philosophizing. Everything has to be precisely calculated and measured. And here it was. On the eve of the presentation, she was worried. As she never worried, never thought of anything better. How to take a pen, a clean notebook, and write a diary of a single woman. Part 2. Really, it didn't work to start writing. The doorbell rang. Sebastian stood on the doorstep. How many times had she imagined this meeting, but she was still confused. Can I come out? Come in, of course. But the children aren't here yet. I wanted to talk to you. To me. But I thought we worked things out. I gave up child support. I gave up the house. What other questions? He looked at her in surprise. Have you changed? The teachers were good. Would you like some tea? Yes, if I may. He came to the kitchen. You changed the furniture in the bar. For some reason, it was nice to see his changed face. Yeah, it wasn't fancy. It's old. It's expensive. Well, I make a good living. He scrutinized his ex-wife. Something about her that made it hard for him to talk. And then he realized there was no sadness in her eyes, and she looked better than when they lived together. Lisa, I don't know how to start this conversation. I just came to ask you out. What about your Betty? Sort of. Sebastian wrinkled his nose. Betty wasn't quite what she was at first. So you decided to go back to where you were safe and happy. Don't twist Lisa's arm. No way. And yet I can't. I don't have any time. I have a presentation tomorrow. He didn't let her finish. He got excited. So am I. I mean, we'll be there. Don't you think that's a sign? Why are you going? I mean, you've never been a big fan of this kind of thing. But Betty, she loves being the center of attention. Sebastian's totally embarrassed. Sebastian, go home. The kids will be here soon. I don't want them to be upset. He obediently got up. Well, I'll see you tomorrow. She shrugged uncertainly. Lisa, in a silver slinky dress with her hair in large curls, sat in front of the mirror. Adriana was putting on the finishing touches, makeup. Every time I start doing you, I get tons of new ideas. It's a shame you can't do it all in one look." Lisa laughed. "What kind of person would I make?" Adriana looked at her carefully. "Tell me, what's eating you?" "My ex-husband came by. He wants to come back, but he's going to tonight's event with his own. He knows you wrote Lisa's notes." "No, you don't. Then be happy. Let him fully realize who he's lost." Lisa looked at Adriana. "Are you conniving?" Adriana grinned. "No, fair." Cindy came in. "It's all ready for you later." The crowd must be overwhelming. Lisa looked out and recoiled. "And I'm not going in there." "Yes, you are. I'm all thirsty for your autograph." "Do you even know that the book sold out in 2 days?" Cindy and Adriana literally shoved her into Charles' arms. "Excuse me." They walked out into the hall to the guests, who were already enjoying appetizers and drinks to loud applause. "Just a second." Clamoring. But then she throws her head back. She's a winner, and that says it all. "Sebastian, why are you standing there like a statue? Let's get closer. I need an autograph." Betty tugged impatiently at his sleeve. He finally snapped out of his stupor. "Oh, come on. You want to go." "What? What kind of tone is that? What do you think you're doing?" He turned to Betty and said, "You want to go. But this is Lisa, my ex-wife." Betty was like walking into ice water. Somebody's been eating hogwash. "You said yourself she works in computer technology." "She does. This must have been a recreational activity." "And you didn't know?" "No, Betty didn't know." To bickering. They didn't notice Charles approaching them. Lisa was immediately followed by her parent Cindy. And of course, Kathy's children, with her usual spontaneity, said, "Daddy, didn't you believe me that Auntie was bad? See, she's hurting you too." Lisa looked at her ex-husband. They talked to her and decided she had to do it. Get rid of the guilt. The one major feeling that almost killed her. It's her fault her husband left her. "Good evening." Sebastian turned around. "Hello." Betty was silent. Lisa smiled charmingly at her. "You wanted an autograph? Let me sign it." She held out her hand for the book Betty was holding. The latter handed it back to her machine, then tossed it away to be avoided. Sebastian looked at Lisa gloomily. "What has become of you? Were you not so angry, so cruel?" That's Sebastian. It was not at all pleasant to realize that someone who had stomped someone into the dirt had not broken down, but had risen up. He looked around. Everyone makes mistakes. I made a mistake too. I want to go back. We have 3 kids, and you know they need a father. What's that all of a sudden? You didn't need a father all this time, and now you do. You're confusing the two. You're the one who thinks you have the right to choose when you want kids and when you don't. Lisa, don't you dare talk to me like that. Charles felt the Larry's hand shake and squeezed it tighter. She has to do it herself. Why? Because he couldn't find the right words. Kevin stepped forward. I can't yell at Mom. You've already turned the kids against me. Sebastian, why are you saying all this? You've never been like this before. He stopped talking. For a while, they all stood in silence. Finally, Sebastian looked for the first time at the man his ex-wife was holding under his arm. Then his gaze shifted back to Lisa. You mean you're not coming back? You don't want our family to be reunited? Lisa smiled. No. Sebastian, no. We don't have a family. Not for a long time. She turned around, and they walked toward the stage. Sebastian caught his ex-wife's mother by the arm. Miranda, you've always been smart and calm. Why don't you talk to your daughter? We should be together. The woman looked at him. No, Sebastian, it's too late. And you know, I'm glad you're divorced. That shook Lisa up. Charles literally made her believe in herself. I'm much more comfortable with Charles as a son-in-law. They're what? She's what? Yes, Sebastian, Lisa is getting married. And I'm sure that husband will never say that she is a gray mouse who is nothing. Miranda slowly walked down the hall. Sebastian watched her silently, and just yesterday, he was sure that he would be welcomed with open arms, that he would be put in the most comfortable chair and loved even more. But it all went wrong. He turned around and rushed out of the auditorium. Now he had to make peace with Betty. He can't go live with his father. He doesn't want to talk to him anyway. After Sebastian dumped Liza. And if he finds out what happened, he won't think he's his son at all. Sebastian breathed in the cold air. An advertisement caught his eye. They were recruiting specialists for a new testing plant in Siberia. He grinned, ripped off his license plate, shoved his hands deep in his pockets, and strode down the street.